and what gets ignored over time. What quietly survives after the stories are polished for tours, television, and movies, and the game of telephone is passed down for generations. This is episode 1, The Stanley Hotel and Why the Legend Does Not Behave the Way It's Supposed to. Before you can understand why the Stanley Hotel feels inconsistent, you have to understand the version of the story most people arrive with. The Stanley Hotel sits in Estes Park, Colorado, built in the early 1900s by Freeland Oscar Stanley. After being diagnosed with tuberculosis in 1903, Stanley was advised by his doctor to relocate to a higher altitude with cleaner air. At the time, Colorado was considered one of the best places in the country for respiratory recovery. Stanley's health improved rapidly after arriving in Estes Park, and what began as a personal medical decision soon evolved into something much larger. Stanley would return to Estes Park every summer, and by 1907 he had fully recovered. He was an inventor and an entrepreneur, best known as the co-founder of the Stanley Motor Carriage Company. He approached the hotel not as a speculative investment, but as a carefully engineered environment. When the hotel finally opened in 1909, it was among the most technologically advanced resorts in the entire region. It featured its own power plant, steam heating, electric lighting, and indoor plumbing at a time when many nearby buildings still relied on oil lamps and wood stoves. Guests arrived in droves by steam-powered carriages, and stays were often long, sometimes lasting weeks, or for the entire season, reinforcing that the hotel's role as a place of recovery rather than quick travel. But most importantly, the Stanley was never designed around death, confinement, or hardship like other paranormal locations. It was built as a place of optimism, a getaway for the wealthy and unwell, marketed on cleanliness, order, and control over the environment. And this matters so much because this is way different than how the hotel is framed today. Unlike many other locations, including some we'll cover here on this podcast later, the Stanley's original purpose was restorative. Any later reputation for unease or hauntings did not grow out of catastrophe, but out of time and reinterpretation. That contrast sits at the core of why the Stanley remains difficult to categorize and why its stories refuse to behave cleanly. Even Freeland Oscar Stanley himself lived to be 91 years old, dying of a heart attack in Newton, Massachusetts, only 1 year after his wife's untimely passing in 1940, far away from where the hotel sits. But there is one documented, devastating event that takes place at the Stanley Hotel, which was a gas explosion in 1911, which injured 7 servers and seriously injured one maid named Elizabeth Wilson of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. The explosion caused structural damage to the hotel, but the account is fragmented and incomplete as stories and articles on the event vary, including Elizabeth's real name. But we will dive into Elizabeth's story in great detail in just a little bit. While the Stanley Hotel sat below a mountain with greenery surrounding it and fresh air flowing, it wasn't always a beautiful, serene place to visit. By the 1970s, the hotel had fallen into such despair that demolition was seriously considered, and its future was uncertain. Occupancy was low, sections of the buildings were closed, and the Stanley existed in kind of a limbo, no longer functioning as the luxury destination it had once been. It was during this time period of decline that the hotel was quiet and nearly empty for long stretches of time. And that's when its modern identity began to take shape. The legend most people know begins with Stephen King and Room 217. In September of 1974, near the end of the tourist season, Stephen King and his wife Tabitha stayed at the Stanley Hotel. At the time, he was still early in his career, and the hotel was preparing to close for the winter. Most guests had already left. Entire floors were empty. On their first night, the Kings were effectively alone in the building with the remaining staff members. That's when Stephen King was assigned to room 217, and that's where a legend was born. With the dining room closing for the season, they were the only diners in the large, echoey space that night. A single meal was prepared for them. A single table was set. The isolation was not subtle or theatrical, it was structural. The long hallways were empty, the stairwells, and a building designed to hold hundreds of people, now holding almost none. That contrast left an impression that had little to do with ghosts and everything to do with scale and absence. King had the same thought that everyone who experienced something in the Stanley Hotel to this day has to ask themselves, what if someone died here? And that remains the question surrounding the Stanley based on what we know. The night of his visit, King reportedly experienced a vivid nightmare in which his young son was being chased through the hotel corridors by a fire hose. He woke suddenly and stepped outside to smoke a cigarette, standing alone on the front steps of a massive building that felt awake in a way he just couldn't articulate. By the time that cigarette was finished, the core idea for The Shining had already taken shape. What the Stanley provided Stephen King was not a haunting in the traditional sense, but a setting where isolation, architecture, and the expectation collapse into something psychologically unstable. The 1977 novel that followed did not tell the story of the Stanley directly, but it permanently altered how the hotel would be seen from that point on. The building became associated with a type of fear rooted in emptiness rather than violence, isolation rather than attack. From that moment forward, the Stanley was no longer just a historic resort with stories attached to it. It became a place where people arrived already carrying a narrative, expecting a building to behave a certain way. And by 1980, when The Shining reached theaters, audiences were confronted with the unforgettable image of Jack Nicholson forcing his way through a door and delivering the now iconic line, "Here's Johnny." From that moment on, the Stanley, whether directly depicted or not, gained a permanent image. After The Shining's success, the Stanley Hotel became associated not just with ghost stories, but the idea that the building itself could become a character, and it did. It was more than a set of twins at the end of the hall saying, "Come and play with us." But Stephen King wasn't the only famous person to leave an imprint on the Stanley Hotel's haunted walls. Jim Carrey requested to stay in the same room, room 217, while filming Dumb and Dumber, as the hotel was used in the movie itself. He reportedly had a strange experience in the middle of the night and had to leave the room in a hurry, returning his key to the front desk and requesting a different room. To this day, he refuses to fully explain what happened that night. But today, when visitors arrive, they know the names of the certain rooms, like room 217. They know the famous encounters. They know which floor they're supposed to pay attention to, and they know what kind of things they're supposed to notice and listen for. Perhaps the elevator that calls the police on its own. But let's not forget the ghost tours offered at the Stanley Hotel that reinforce all of this expectation. In just 60 minutes, you could learn about the haunted halls of the Stanley with big tie-ins to The Shining, loaded with historical facts. Guests are guided through curated spaces, stories are told in a specific order, and certain details are emphasized, but others are left out entirely. The experience becomes repeatable, predictable, and importantly brief. Most people spend an hour inside the story and then leave with only the knowledge provided by the tour itself. What often goes unmentioned is that the majority of reported experience at the Stanley do not happen during tours or daytime hours. They happen late. They happen when people are alone. Now let's get to Elizabeth Wilson. Many guests and staff report experience tied to Elizabeth. Now this was who was seriously injured in the aforementioned gas explosion in 1911. Elizabeth was hurled from the second to the first floor of the hotel with both ankles breaking during the explosion. But when the story was reprinted by the Lancaster paper, her hometown, the editor added an important note. They could not find any record of an Elizabeth Wilson in local directories and were unable to confirm that she ever even lived or worked in Lancaster at all. Other Colorado newspapers reported the incident under a different name, Elizabeth Lambert, and added dramatic details that were never confirmed elsewhere. The most thorough account appeared on June 29th in the Fort Collins Express. That article strips away much of the embellishment and directly refutes one of the most repeated claims, stating clearly that the maid was not thrown from the second floor at all. It is known that Elizabeth remained working at the Stanley until 1951, when she unfortunately died in her sleep. While her story may be foggy, her spirit is said to still roam the halls of the Stanley at night today. Over the years, guests have claimed lights turning on and off, luggage being moved, or clothing mysteriously folded when no one was in the room. I could use some of that. Some say if unmarried couples stay there, a cold presence pushes them apart as if enforcing its own set of rules, like a chaperone. One of the other rooms you may encounter on a ghost tour at the Stanley Hotel is Lucy's room, and it seems to have a sweet tooth. According to legend, Lucy died at the hotel and now appears as a playful child spirit, often interacting with guests. She is said to move objects, leave small items behind, and most famously, accept lollipops left out for her by visitors. Guests report finding the candy unwrapped, moved, or missing altogether. The story is often framed as gentle and harmless. A child ghost who simply just wants attention, or some sweets. What is rarely addressed is that there is no historical record confirming a child named Lucy ever died at the Stanley Hotel. The lollipop tradition appears to have emerged much later, passing down through tours and ghost stories rather than documentation. Once the idea took hold, behavior started following the expectation. But over time, Lucy became less of a historical figure and more of a shared ritual. The presence is maintained not through evidence, but through repetition, and of course her favorite, Dum Dum lollipops. Another presence frequently associated with the Stanley Hotel is Flora Stanley herself, Freeland Oscar Stanley's wife. Guests and staff have long reported hearing piano music drifting through the building, often late at night when no one's scheduled to be playing. The sound is typically described as soft and deliberate, as if someone were practicing rather than performing. In some accounts, the music seems to stop the moment it is acknowledged. Accompanying these reports is recurring mention of a floral scent, most often described as roses, appearing in otherwise empty rooms or hallways. Now, what complicates these reports and Flora's story is that she was very much alive during the hotel's early years and was known to enjoy music and hospitality. The piano itself has been moved and restored over time, and the building's acoustics allow sound to travel in unexpected ways. As for the scent, the hotel has a long history of floral arrangements, perfumes, and cleaning products that have changed across decades, yet the pairing of music and roses continues to be reported together, reinforcing the image of Flora as a lingering presence, whether this is memory imprinting, environmental coincidence, or something just unexplained. The consistency of the pairing has kept Flora's story alive. Now let's not forget about Freeland Oscar Stanley himself. He's sometimes included in the Stanley Hotel's paranormal lore, but his presence is mentioned far less often and with much less confidence than figures like Flora, Elizabeth, or Lucy. When he does appear in reports, it's usually tied to the billiards room. Guests and staff have described seeing a well-dressed man, often in early 20th century attire, standing near the billiard table or watching quietly before disappearing. Others report the feeling of being observed in that space without seeing anything at all. Historically, Freeland Stanley was deeply involved in the hotel's design and operations. But because he died at home in Massachusetts and not in the hotel itself, some investigators treat reports of him as symbolic rather than literal, a projection of the building's identity as much as a haunting. Like much of the hotel's legend, his supposed presence exists in a gray area, acknowledged by some, ignored by others, but never clearly confirmed. Now, while some people stay in these spaces night after night and nothing happens at all, there are also claims of opening doors or lights turning on by themselves that you just can't explain. Even tour guides have been physically touched with their hair being pulled or felt physically ill while exploring the Stanley's halls or giving a tour. Famously, Jason Hawes of Ghost Hunters described the Stanley Hotel as the most memorable location his team has ever investigated, noting the sheer volume and variety of experiences reported here. During their 2006 investigation, which you can find online, Hawes spent a night in room 401 with his team where a closet door opened and closed on camera, and a glass on the bedside table broke without explanation. It just happened. On another night, team members reported hearing a disembodied voice and unexplained sounds in the restricted basement, included what some interpreted as a voice saying hello. These experiences highlight a broader pattern that is often overlooked, which is timing. Many of the most cited reports, just like this one, at the Stanley occur during periods of low occupancy, whether they're late in the season or during winter months, the overnight shifts, the maintenance hours, or security rounds. They happen when no one's around. This mirrors Stephen King's original Stay, which inspired The Shining, which is often mentioned but rarely examined under the microscope. The building was quiet and nearly empty. This wasn't during the day or on a crowded ghost tour. Now that raises an uncomfortable question regarding the Stanley. Are people responding to something in the building, or to an experience of being left alone inside something much larger than themselves? Did the Stanley take shape as the paranormal entity itself? The legend doesn't answer that. The tours don't even ask it. But if you're trying to understand the Stanley rather than consume it, you can't ignore these questions. Because once you strip away the movie tie-ins, the merchandise, and the guided tours, what remains is not a haunted hotel with rules. It's a place that behaves differently depending on who's there, how long they stay, and what they expect to happen. But it does happen nonetheless. Now, environmental factors can also shape what people perceive. In older buildings, wiring and electrical systems behave differently when load changes at night, which can make lights flicker. Temperature and pressure shifts can cause doors to move. And large, rigid structures with high ceilings can carry sound in unexpected ways, making footsteps or distant noises seem directional even when they are not. Now, I'm not saying that's exactly what happened in these claims, but you have to think about it. This only complicates what guests see because they only know what they perceive in the moment. They don't know what's been updated. They don't know what lights are on and what's working and what's not. There's also often talk of an underground cave beneath the Stanley Hotel, but this is one area where wording matters. What exists beneath the hotel is not a natural cave network, but a series of underground service tunnels, crawl spaces, and utility corridors built to support heating, plumbing, and staff movement. These spaces run beneath portions of the property and were historically used by employees to move unseen beneath areas of the hotel, especially during harsh weather or overnight shifts. But because these lower levels pass through bedrock rich in limestone and quartz, some paranormal enthusiasts believe that environment may amplify or retain energy, a theory frequently cited in ghost lore, though not supported by science. What is more grounded are the reports themselves. Employees working late or moving through these tunnels have described footsteps behind them, voices that do not match any nearby coworkers, and the persistent feeling that something else is present when no one should be. Whether these experiences are shaped by the acoustics, isolation, the limestone and quartz, or something harder to define, the underground area remains one of the few places in the hotel where staff accounts continue quietly long after tours and guests have gone to bed. But then there's the renovation history of the hotel. Every major renovation alters how the building behaves. Walls are reinforced, furniture in the rooms are swapped out with newer material. But after some renovations, reports increase. After others, they drop sharply. This is rarely framed as meaningful, but it should be. Another thing that rarely gets discussed is time lag. Many experiences are not reported immediately. Guests often wait until they leave. Staff sometimes waits years to share their stories. But by the time the story is shared, details have already shifted. Memory fills the gaps, emotion smooths the edges, and expectation rewrites the sequence. Now, this does not make the personal accounts dishonest. It only makes them human. And there's also the issue of selective storytelling. Certain stories are repeated because they're safe. Elizabeth, Flora, Lucy, many of the ones we heard today. They fit the narrative of the hotel and they sound good on tours. But the other stories disappear because they're boring or contradictory, even if they might be more credible. A light may flicker once, but that does not survive retelling when compared to lollipop wrappers moving from one shelf to another. A sound that cannot be placed does not become a legend when compared to the angelic sound of Flora's keys. A week of nothing happening at all is forgotten entirely when compared to Elizabeth packing a guest's bags and leaving them outside his door. What remains is a curated version of experience shaped by stories passed down and repeated. And then there's one detail, and it might be the most important detail of them all, that almost never gets mentioned in the ghost lore. The Stanley Hotel is still functioning. It's not abandoned or frozen in time. It is active with staff. It's cleaned, repaired, and modernized over time. That matters. Most famous haunted locations are preserved in decay, and we will cover those also. But the Stanley Hotel is preserved in use, and we are grateful for it still standing today. The Stanley Hotel sits in a strange middle ground, famous enough to attract expectation and active enough to resist consistency, which doesn't lead to a clean conclusion, but it does lead to a more honest one. The evidence at the Stanley Hotel is not dramatic because it's overwhelming. It's compelling because it refuses to align. And that unresolved overlap is the most important thing to notice, because once you stop asking whether the Stanley is haunted and start asking why the evidence refuses to settle, you begin to see the place differently. Not as a story to be consumed, but as a system that reacts to presence, change, and attention. And that sets up the final question this episode needs to leave open. Why does this story persist? Most paranormal locations fade once their stories harden, once the rules are set, once people know what's supposed to happen and where. The unknown loses tension when it becomes predictable. This has never happened here. This hotel does not perform on command. It doesn't deliver repeatable results, and it does not reward belief or punish skepticism. Some people arrive expecting an experience and leave with nothing. Others arrive indifferent and leave unsettled. Many leave unsure of what they felt at all. That uncertainty frustrates people on both sides of the paranormal spectrum. We like our stories clean, with origins, names, and rules. The Stanley does offer some of those, and those are the stories surviving tours and retellings. Flora at the piano, Lucy and the candy, Elizabeth in room 217. These narratives give shape to something that is otherwise difficult to hold on to. But outside those legends are moments that never fully settle into story. These moments may not provide answers or solve the mystery of the hotel, but they keep the story alive and invite us to pay closer attention to what is here. In the next episode, we move to a location where people did not come to visit, explore, or stay by choice. A place built for isolation at scale, where nights stretched long for staff and was endless for those left behind. A place shaped by exhaustion and the quiet weight of watching people fade away. Waverly Hills Sanatorium. I'm Johnny Clash, and this is Paranormal Unsettled. Thanks for listening. Imagine a place where staying was never meant to be temporary. Patients guided by hope and promise that one day they will return home happy and healthy. A structure frozen in time, shaped by disease, death, and long uncertainty. When night falls, all explanation begins to fail. Noises fade, boundaries soften, true isolation takes over. This episode is about what remains inside these walls and what refuses to settle into reason. I'm Johnny Clash. I'm a dad, a gamer, a former pro wrestler, and a paranormal enthusiast. I believe there is something out there, something we do not fully understand. But I'm not here to prove anything or tear it apart. I'm here to observe, to explore, and to look closely at what happens when expectation meets the unknown. This is Paranormal Unsettled. Waverly Hills Sanatorium is one of the most famous paranormal locations in America. Known for its reputation, its imagery, and decades of stories tied to illness, death, and confinement. The base of these tales originate from long lists of documented trauma centered around tuberculosis. But what's inside this building is much more prominent now than it ever was. Waverly Hills was not built for visitors. It was built to hold people in place with a dividing line. Sick on one side, really sick on the other. To separate them from the outside world and measure their lives in charts, routines, and quiet hours, hoping they one day make it out. But unfortunately, most did not. During the day, the structure is readable. You move through rooms knowing you will leave. At night, that logic collapses. Corridors stretch longer than expected. Sounds travel further than they should. Silence feels active rather than empty. This is where many of the stories, legends, and evidence takes shape. Not during moments staged for fear, but during the hours when nothing was supposed to happen at all. That inconsistency is the point. This is episode 2, Waverly Hills Sanatorium, a place designed for permanence and remembered for what can never be contained. Unlike the Stanley Hotel, which is not tied to a series of horrific events leading to its paranormal identity, the Waverly Hills Sanatorium has a deep background of recorded legacy. The land now known as Waverly Hills was originally purchased in 1883 by Major Thomas H. Hayes as a family home. Because the area was far from existing schools, Hayes opened a small one-room classroom for his daughters, naming it Waverly Schools after Walter Scott's Waverly novels. He later adapted the same name for the property itself, and when the Tuberculosis Board purchased the land during the worldwide pandemic, they kept it. The well-known sanatorium sits on a wooded hillside outside Louisville, Kentucky, originally built in 1910 as tuberculosis was at its highest and sanatoriums were used as quarantine zones all around the country. At the time, tuberculosis was one of the leading causes of death in the United States, and isolation was considered the only effective form of treatment. As cases increased, the facility expanded rapidly, eventually becoming a massive 5-story complex designed to house hundreds of patients at once, far removed from the city below. Life inside Waverly Hills followed strict routines meant to preserve both order and morale. Patients were encouraged to spend time outdoors, eat regularly, and participate in music and social activities when possible. A little bit of normalcy. Despite these efforts, the reality of the disease was unavoidable. Mortality rates were high, treatments were experimental, and many patients spent months or years confined to the building until their number was ultimately called. To manage the constant presence of death, a tunnel was constructed beneath the hospital to discreetly transport bodies away from patient areas. A practical decision that will later become one of the most referenced features in its legend, and one we will cover here in just a little bit. By the 1920s, the original Waverly Hills building was struggling. Wooden structures needed constant repair, the hospital required a more durable design, and there simply weren't enough beds for patients. Construction of a new 5-story building began in March of 1924, designed to hold over 400 patients. It finally opened on October 17, 1926, and served as a tuberculosis hospital until the introduction of streptomycin in 1943, gradually reducing the cases. But by June of 1961, the need for such a large facility had ended, and remaining patients were transferred to Hazelwood Sanatorium, also in Louisville. Now, with tuberculosis finally under control, the building reopened as Woodhaven Geriatric Center in 1962, a nursing home for aging patients with dementia, limited mobility, and severe mental disabilities. Unfortunately, the facility was overcrowded and understaffed, leading to repeated reports of neglect. Because of this, the state of Kentucky closed Woodhaven in 1980, leaving the 5-story structure without a proper tenant for the first time in nearly 40 years. The building went through several ownership changes and redevelopment plans over the next decades, when in 1983, a developer proposed converting it into a minimum security prison, but the plan was dropped after local protests. Later, there was a proposal to turn it into apartments, but those plans failed in 1996 when Robert Alberhaysky purchased the property and aimed to build a massive Christ the Redeemer-inspired statue on the roof, along with an arts and worship center. Despite his ambitious plans to build the world's largest statue of Jesus Christ, the project never received enough funding and was canceled by 1997. Now, after a few years in limbo, Tina and Charlie Mattingly purchased what was once Waverly Hills in 2001. They run historical and paranormal tours as well as public investigations of the once overrun building. Each Halloween, a haunted house takes shape, and what better place to host the attraction? Currently, they are working on restoring the windows and interior, preserving the building while keeping its haunted legacy alive. Now, as I mentioned before, beneath Waverly Hills lies a network of service tunnels, the most famous of which was built to carry steam, coal, and other supplies between the heating plant at the bottom of the hill and the main sanatorium building. These tunnels were a vital part of the hospital's operations, allowing staff to move heavy materials efficiently without disrupting daily patient care. The tunnel system included a small cable car designed to transport items up and down the incline, reducing the physical strain on workers and speeding deliveries. Over time, these tunnels became an essential, though largely unseen, part of the sanatorium's daily life, supporting everything from laundry and food deliveries to maintenance work. Now, during a brief period between 1920 and 1940s, the tunnel took on a much darker function. Also called or referred to as the death chutes, stories claim they were used to discreetly transport the bodies of deceased patients down to ambulances waiting at the bottom of the hill. This process was meant to spare other patients from the immediate knowledge of yet another death in the building, trying to keep morale up. Because the tunnels were never open to the public and largely unmonitored, they became a source of legend over the years. Visitors and investigators have long reported strange sounds, like footsteps, and the feeling of being watched when exploring these underground passages. The stories add a layer of tension and mystery as the tunnels connect the hospital's practical history with its darker reputation. Even today, the tunnels are part of Waverly Hills' allure. They represent a link to the hospital's past, from the daily logistics of running a sanatorium to the ways the staff tried to manage death quietly and efficiently. For paranormal enthusiasts, they remain one of the most compelling and chilling parts of the property, a place where history and legend overlap in ways that are impossible to fully separate. The tunnels have also inspired modern storytelling. In 2006, the American horror film Death Tunnel was filmed on location, using the tunnels as its chilling backdrop. The film opens with a dedication: "To all the lost souls of Waverly Hills Sanatorium, may you find your way home." This nod to the real history of the sanatorium reinforces how the tunnels themselves have become symbolic, not just for practical use, but for the lingering presence and stories of those who lived and those who died. Now, Waverly Hills did not begin as a place of fear. As I just spoke about, the intention behind the sanatorium was meant for good. Sanatoriums like this were built not to hide the sick, but to save them. Fresh air, sunlight, rest, and isolation were all considered medicine, and the woodsy hillside was the perfect location. The building's elevation and isolation were not ominous choices, they were rooted in hope, much like we saw with Freeland Oscar Stanley and the Stanley Hotel. Yes, there were tests done inside Waverly Hills that today would be considered inhumane and impractical, but in the early 1900s, it provided the only hope a doctor would need. Patients would sometimes undergo artificial pneumothorax procedures, easy for me to say, which would replace a partially collapsed lung with a balloon. Or patients could also have lymph nodes removed, electroshock therapy, or the most extreme and painful treatment, thoracoplasty, which involved removing up to 8 ribs. But the cultural shift began slowly, and it began with the progress mentioned earlier with the introduction of antibiotics, specifically streptomycin, dramatically reducing tuberculosis deaths. Waverly Hills corridors emptied not because of tragedy, but because medicine had finally caught up. As the building's needs decreased, its structure and purpose began to erode. Entire wings were closed off. Floors that once held beds and staff fell completely silent. The rhythms that had defined the hospital for decades just disappeared. This was not a dramatic collapse, but a gradual quieting. And quiet, in a building designed to be full of human movement, has a way of changing how a place feels. Absence creates space for interpretation. The hospital had not become sinister, but it had become unfamiliar. Now, when Waverly Hills closed as a tuberculosis hospital, it marked a critical psychological turning point. The building was no longer associated with healing, even imperfect healing. It was now a relic of an era people wanted to forget. Tuberculosis had carried stigma and long suffering. Closing the hospital didn't erase those associations, it froze them in place. What remained was a massive structure now filled with memories, but no longer anchored to a clear function. The reopening of the building as Woodhaven Geriatric Center deepened the shift. Unlike the sanatorium era, Woodhaven quickly developed the troubled reputation we spoke of earlier. While not all stories were verified, the perception mattered. Public trust in the institution weakened. This was no longer a place framed as necessary medical refuge. It became a place people felt uneasy about, even during its operation. The building absorbed that unease and continued its legacy of negativity in the preceding years. When Woodhaven inevitably closed, the transformation was complete. Waverly Hills was now abandoned, and abandonment changes narrative faster than almost anything else. Nature reclaimed parts of the structure. Windows broke, hallways decayed, snakes and spiders run through those tunnels which once transported the dead. Without context, the building began to look like what people expected a haunted place to look like. The suffering associated with tuberculosis blended with later allegations, neglect stories, silence. Time compressed decades of unrelated events into a single emotional memory. The building simply remained behind to carry that weight. By the time pop culture and paranormal investigations arrived, the groundwork had already been laid. The hospital's medical history was no longer the focus. The fear of disease, isolation, and death had been repackaged as fear of the unknown and questions like, who still walks these halls? That is the true cultural shift here. Not a single moment of violence, not a single tragedy, but a slow redefinition of purpose, memory, and meaning. Waverly Hills became a staple of early 2000s paranormal television, appearing on shows like Ghost Hunters, Ghost Adventures, Most Haunted, and Paranormal Lockdown. These shows framed the building as one of the most active and dangerous haunted locations in the United States. Thermal anomalies, EVPs, shadow figures, and the emotional reactions from investigators were framed into compelling narratives that emphasized intensity over ambiguity. A simple Google search or YouTube search of Waverly Hills evidence will show you many unexplained anomalies taken over the years, and not just by these television shows. Now, while these shows remain the focal point, and while some are skeptical of the results, you can't deny what they caught. On Ghost Hunters, which visited Waverly Hills multiple times, the TAPS team documented striking visual evidence. During their visits in Season 2 and later in the rebooted version, investigators captured thermal footage of what appeared to be multiple shadowy figures moving through hallways, with no one visible on conventional cameras. Investigators later witnessed a ball placed in a corridor roll on its own with no noticeable draft or human contact, adding to the mystery. And like we mentioned before, just a quick YouTube search and you will find many EVPs and disembodied voices that pair with what Ghost Hunters found on television. Now, other shows like Most Haunted emphasized visual phenomena. The crew reported shadow figures moving at the end of the corridor and sudden feelings of dizziness or nausea among investigators while filming. At times, doors appeared to move without visible cause and crew members reacted to perceived touches or pressure. Now, Ghost Adventures took a more aggressive approach, as they always do. Zach Baggins, Nick Groff, and Aaron Goodwin dove straight in using full spectrum and night vision cameras. The team reported black apparitions moving down the hallway and physical sensations of pressure and lethargy, especially when Zach laid inside the old morgue cooler, where he described feeling overwhelmingly drained and compelled to leave the area. In addition, the crew referenced local lore about shadow entities and doppelgangers thought to be active in the building and set up spirit boxes and EMF devices that they claimed produced fragmented responses and unexplained equipment activity during their overnight stay. Now, millions of viewers encountered Waverly Hills for the first time through this lens, and then through the internet. For many, their initial understanding of the site did not come from medical history, but from night vision footage and dramatic narration, I guess like this one. This reframed the building from the former hospital into an active paranormal hotspot once again. And while we know the death toll was high, pop culture frequently repeats inflated or incorrect numbers associated with Waverly Hills, often citing deaths in the tens of thousands without context. These figures are rarely sourced and almost never adjusted for the decades the hospital operated or the realities of early 20th century tuberculosis care. The range of patients' deaths is said to be somewhere between 6 to 60,000, a dramatically wide range, though the real documented number may be closer to 8 to 10,000. We may never know the true number, but regardless, the death toll is still staggering. These high numbers suggest overwhelming tragedy and make the hauntings feel inevitable. The repetition of these claims across shows, blogs, and documentaries has cemented them in public memory, even when historians dispute their accuracy. And if the attention from television wasn't enough, Waverly Hills once played house to the sounds of the Underground Music Festival. This was the last stop of the tour in 2007, featuring bands like Lamb of God, Guar, Hatebreed, Chimera, Shadows Fall, The Acacia Strain, and Job for a Cowboy, with surprise guest Behemoth. What's cooler than a heavy metal concert with some of the most popular names in the genre headbanging inside an abandoned sanatorium? I'm in. Much of Waverly Hills lore centers on the upper floors, particularly the 4th and 5th, which were once patient wards. However, you still may see the doctor in his white coat entering a patient's room, or the hospital chef still in the kitchen with the smell of freshly baked bread guiding you to his ovens. Shadowy figures are said to glide along the hallways, appearing for only a moment before vanishing into the walls. Guests and investigators report fleeting glimpses of movement in darkened corners, the sensation of being watched, and cold spots that seem to shift unpredictably. Some even see a woman running towards them with cut wrists, screaming. And this isn't limited to just the investigators you see on TV. Most of the evidence is caught during public investigations on the property. These encounters are often framed as residual energy, which are imprints left behind by those who endured the sanatorium's harsh conditions. Visitors also recount auditory phenomena that adds to the building's eerie reputation. Echoes of coughing, crying, and the shuffling of footsteps down empty corridors are frequently reported, especially late at night when the building is quiet. I just got goosebumps on my arm. Some claim these sounds are the remnants of tuberculosis patients frozen in time and stuck in a loop of repeating their final painful moments of life. Others describe whispers, disembodied voices, and the occasional distant scream. Experiences that cannot easily be verified yet persist in the retellings that surround Waverly Hills. Each report builds on the narrative that the hospital itself holds memory, replaying suffering for those who entered and didn't make it out. While the actual death count is in question, 2 documented and kind of recent deaths did occur on the property after the sanatorium was abandoned. One man was beaten to death at the hands of drug dealers in one of the most horrific deaths the property has ever seen. The other, a man fell down the elevator shaft alongside his dog while taking a stroll through the halls. Now, this would explain the encounter. Current owner Tina Mattingly has reported as she saw a man and his dog walking around when locking up one night after a tour. Though most encounters are brief, the most common anomaly is an entity known as the Creeper. The Creeper is a large shadow figure that has been spotted climbing the walls and the ceiling of the 4th floor, but can vanish in the blink of an eye. Many have captured what they believe to be the Creeper when taking photos here. Doppelgangers may also be the scariest entity roaming around at night. Visitors will see a version of themselves in the dark hallways, but doppelgangers are often seen as an omen of bad luck or impending death, so maybe try to avoid that one if you can. Now, while the volume of death at Waverly Hills certainly left a mark on the collective imagination, the real history of Waverly Hills paints a far more grounded picture than the legend suggests. When thinking about tuberculosis patients and even the geriatric center to follow, we often forget that children were not immune to this deadly disease and play a significant role in Waverly Hills lore. Legends speak of a young boy named Timmy whose story is still stuck in the building's infinite loop. Timmy was a patient at the sanatorium during the early 20th century. In the stories passed down through tours and ghost hunting accounts, Timmy is depicted as a playful spirit who roams the hallways, sometimes leaving small, tangible reminders of his presence. Guests have reported hearing a child laughing in empty corridors or feeling a tap on the shoulder when no one is near, experiences attributed to his restless childlike energy. While that might sound great to investigators looking to capture some fun evidence, the real story behind Timmy is far more tragic than the playful ghost legend suggests. Records indicate that he was indeed a young patient who spent significant time in the upper floors of the hospital, where most of the severe cases were treated. Like many children at Waverly Hills, Timmy endured isolation, limited contact with his family, and the harsh realities of a disease and the thought that he will never make it home. His death was recorded in hospital logs, and it's believed he succumbed to the complications from tuberculosis, though specific details about his life and family remain minimal. The lack of comprehensive records has allowed folklore to fill in the gaps, transforming Timmy into the spectral figure known today. Despite the tragic reality, Timmy's story has taken on a life of its own in modern ghost lore. Many visitors leave small tokens for him, like toys or coins, believed to attract his spirit. You might even roll a ball on the 4th floor, and it might just roll back to you. In this way, Timmy exists in 2 realms: the documented history of a child who suffered and died in the sanatorium, and the legend of a spirit whose presence continues to captivate the imaginations of those who walk Waverly Hills' empty halls at night. If you ever visit, you might spot those tokens left beneath the upper floor's window, hoping Timmy makes an appearance. So what makes Waverly Hills feel the most uneasy is that nothing fully settles into place. The building responds differently to different people, under different conditions, with no clear rules governing the outcome. Rather than weakening the mystery, these inconsistencies strengthen it. They suggest a place that does not perform on command and refuses to behave the way a haunted location is expected to. For decades, Waverly Hills was a place of routine, but one of the most overlooked elements is how long the building functioned as an active medical center compared to how long it has existed in ruin. The majority of the building's life was structured, repetitive, and controlled. That normalcy is rarely acknowledged, even though it shaped the environment far more than the brief moments of crisis that dominate the legend. Another missing piece is how profoundly the environment affects perception. Waverly Hills sits isolated on a hill, removed from the surrounding neighborhoods, security at the gates with limited natural light once inside. Long corridors, identical rooms, and heavy concrete construction distort sound and depth perception. At night, with minimal lighting and little external reference, the brain fills the gaps aggressively. This does not invalidate any experience, but it does reframe them. Sensations feel amplified, not because something is present, but because the setting strips away grounded cues that people unconsciously rely on. Finally, Waverly Hills is often treated as frozen in its darkest moment, when in reality it has passed through multiple identities: hospital, nursing home, abandoned structure, failed redevelopment site, and now a tourist destination. Don't forget about concert hall. Each phase altered how the building was used, modified, and remembered. Paranormal claims are often attributed to the sanatorium era alone, even when they originated decades later. Ignoring these transitions simplifies the story, but it also erases the context that might explain why the experiences feel fragmented, inconsistent, and unresolved. What if that large statue of Jesus Christ was built at this location? Would anything inside change? What if? Many places known for hauntings lose their power once their stories settle into something predictable. Once expectations are set and outcomes feel rehearsed, the mystery thins out. Waverly Hills never reached that point. Its reputation endures not because it delivers the same experience, but because it fails to do so. So sure, you may book a tour and experience an apparition or even a shadow figure. The proof is there, but the reality is you may experience nothing at all. Maybe just some spiders or snakes occupying the building where a deadly disease once ran rampant. We want beginnings, causes, names, and rules that explain why something happens and when it will happen again. Waverly Hills provides fragments of that with familiar figures but skewed numbers. Stories that fit neatly into tours and retellings. They give form to the experience and make it even easier to talk about. But beyond those anchors are moments that never fully crystallize. Experiences that resist being shaped into a clean narrative. They do not resolve the question. They keep it open. That unpredictability is not a failure of the story. It's the reason the story continues. In the next episode, we move to a place where arrival wasn't voluntary. Not for rest, not for healing, but for punishment. A structure built to isolate rather than observe, shaped by silence, surveillance, and long hours spent alone. Eastern State Penitentiary. I'm Johnny Clash, and this is Paranormal Unsettled. Thanks for listening. While some places are designed around observation, visibility, and control, others are constructed with a very different intention. These are spaces meant to separate and to gradually erase a person's presence from the world beyond their walls. In these places, attention is not focused on watching life unfold, but on ensuring that it disappears from view altogether. Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum was conceived as a solution, a way to organize illness, behavior, and fear into something manageable. With the original intention of a home away from home, what this asylum became was far from it. Locked doors replaced conversation, and patients were treated as inmates. Treatment became routine, but what that treatment turned into was far beyond disturbing. This is a building that feels clinical and imposing, a massive stone structure designed to endure. But when daytime activity fades, the space changes. Sound lingers longer than expected. Empty rooms feel occupied by the patients that once piled into a single room, looking for somewhere to heal. I'm Johnny Clash, a dad, a gamer, a former pro wrestler, and a lifelong observer of the unexplained. I'm not here to persuade belief or disbelief. I'm here to document, to listen, and to stay with questions that do not resolve neatly. This is Paranormal Unsettled. Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum is often remembered as a hospital for the mentally insane, but that label does not quite capture its full reality. It was designed to restore order, but through unorthodox and old-fashioned methods that today would be considered torture. This episode is not focused on proving what remains or even naming it. It's about examining what happens when people are reduced to numbers, and the uneasy details get swept under the rug or hidden to only be revealed years later. Trans-Allegheny does not announce its background story, but it reveals it slowly the longer you look. And the longer you sit down with the uncomfortable information, the harder it becomes to tell where the documented history ends and something else begins. Life in the mid-1800s was harsh, and care for the mentally ill was often harsher, as you can tell by the name of the asylum itself. What would become the Lunatic Asylum began in the early 1850s as Weston State Hospital, built to house and treat patients in a world that had few answers and even fewer comforts for the ill. This all came to be during a period when the United States was actively rethinking how mental illness should be treated. The site chosen in Weston, West Virginia was meant to serve as a centralized facility to treat patients all across the region. From the beginning, the project was ambitious in both size and philosophy, taking up a colossal 242,000 square feet with 13 buildings on a 666-acre plot of land. Yes, 666. This building has no small footprint. The building followed the Kirkbride Plan, an architectural approach developed by Thomas Story Kirkbride. His ideas centered on the belief that environment played a major role in recovery, and early on, that's exactly what it did here. Patients were meant to live in orderly, well-lit spaces with access to fresh air, working hours, and freedom of movement across the grounds. The hospital was designed to feel more like a self-contained community rather than a prison, and way early on, this approach did seem promising. While the ideology for Trans-Allegheny seemed to work at first, construction was interrupted in 1858 when the Civil War reached the region. Union soldiers halted progress and used the land and the partially built structure for military purposes. When the work eventually resumed, the hospital opened in stages, finally welcoming patients during the 1860s. At that time, the facility was built to house roughly 250 individuals, each with their own private room. And for a brief period, that's the way the hospital largely operated. Now, as the years passed, admissions increased at an alarming rate that the institution could not manage. By the late 19th century, the number of patients had doubled, then tripled, without corresponding expansions in staff or resources. Conditions began to deteriorate as rooms designed for one person were forced to hold several. Hallways and common spaces were repurposed as sleeping areas, and cages were placed for individuals to stay. Yes, cages, like rabid animals. Eventually, overcrowding had reached extreme levels. Records indicate that by the late 1930s, the hospital was operating at more than 6 times its original capacity. This strain led to shortages of food, clothing, and medical attention, with staff running around not able to manage what they were truly there to do. With the overcrowding and neglect on not only the patients, the structure itself began to decay, with mold growing on windows, walls peeling, and heating systems failing during the winter months. Part of the overcrowding stemmed from how loosely the term mental illness was applied. While many patients did suffer from psychological conditions, others were admitted for physical illnesses such as tuberculosis, like we saw with Waverly Hills, or even just asthma. Some were institutionalized for social reasons, especially women were targeted, including defying a spouse, period cramps, reading too much, being too religious, or not enough religious, or expressing political unrest. Imagine that in today's climate. By the 1950s, the population peaked at around 2,600 patients, and some of them were not friendly. The third floor of the asylum housed the most violent men, all in the same room. Could you imagine what went on in there? Not only was the staff scared, but newcomers were also introduced to violence and neglect immediately. Some of them not even in there for a real reason. During this era, aggressive and experimental treatments became routine. Lobotomies were performed in large numbers, often using crude methods that caused permanent damage or death. Other treatments include insulin-induced comas, electroconvulsion therapy, and heavy use of early psychiatric medicines that left patients sedated rather than healed. One of the most brutal was hydrotherapy, where the subject would be placed under high-walled bathtubs filled with freezing cold water for extended periods ranging from hours up to several days. These procedures reflected the medical thinking of the time, but often stripped patients of autonomy and identity. One of the most disturbing cases involved Dr. Walter Freeman, a man seeking notoriety by using an ice pick to perform 2,500 of his 3,500 lobotomies. Often referred to as the lobotomist, he was not a trained surgeon, though he did perform all of these procedures, even on children as young as 4 years old. Freeman treated the operation as a solution rather than a last resort, moving quickly, publicly, and without regard for long-term consequences. Patients were altered permanently, often left unable to care for themselves, while Freeman gained the attention, the lectures, and the headlines that he wanted, and of course, the money to go with it. It was experimentation framed as progress, but when you were sent to the medical center on the property to recover, that basically meant game over. As mental health care evolved and public opinion shifted, large institutions like Trans-Allegheny fell out of favor. Funding declined, patient populations were reduced, and the hospital struggled to justify its continued operation. In 1994, after more than a century of use, the hospital officially closed its doors. After closure, the building stood largely abandoned. The only significant addition after its operational years was a cemetery where many former patients were buried, often under numbered markers rather than names. But over time, the site was preserved and reopened for tours. Today, Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum exists as both a museum and a symbol. Its history reflects changing attitudes towards mental health care and control. What began as an optimistic experiment gradually became a cautionary example of what happens when systems outgrow compassion. The building remains, holding the weight of thousands of lives that pass through its corridors, many of them never truly leaving. The cultural identity of Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum did not change all at once. It shifted gradually, shaped by distance from its original function and by the growing need to reinterpret places that no longer fit comfortably into modern life. Once its doors were no longer used for care or confinement, the building entered a new phase where meaning was assigned rather than enforced. The structure stopped representing treatment and instead came to represent the consequences of certainty. What happens when a system believes it has the right answers? The asylum now stands as a reminder of how authority, fear, and incomplete understanding can reshape lives without visible violence. Paranormal media played a major role in this transition. Ghost investigation videos and television series reframed the asylum not as a medical site but as a place where emotional residue might remain. Residual energy. Online platforms accelerated this shift. Short-form videos, overnight investigations, and personal reaction footage brought the asylum into a new generation of storytelling and deeming it the most haunted place in America. These creators often spoke less about what happens there and more about how it felt to stand inside. The unease, the pressure, silence. Listening to their emotions, allowing audiences to project their own interpretation onto the space. Even without knowing the specific stories, visitors often describe a sense of heaviness or alertness. The building does not invite relaxation and never really did, even when it was open. Its scale, acoustics, and isolation encourage inward focus, which can amplify perception and heighten emotional response. That reaction alone for many is to believe something still remains. The asylum now exists as a cultural mirror. Skeptics, believers, historians, and now thrill seekers all enter the same space and leave with different conclusions. That flexibility is part of its power. It does not demand belief, but it rewards the attention it's receiving. Each visit becomes a personal interpretation layered onto thousands of others. But when you first walk into this building, it looks wide. It looks empty. It doesn't look that bad. But as you go deeper, as you make rights and lefts and go upstairs, that's when you see it in a different way. What draws people back is not just the idea of spirits, but the sense that the building remembers. Not in a literal way, but in how it holds everything in. Pop culture reinforced this image by repeatedly placing the asylum along other locations associated with mystery and unresolved energy. Lists of haunted places, horror-themed travel features, seasonal programming positioned it as a destination rather than a cautionary tale. Over time, the label of haunted became a cultural shorthand for something deeper and less definable. Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum has become a recurring fixture in paranormal television and even movies, often used as a proving ground rather than a backdrop. Movies such as One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest or Season 2 of American Horror Story Asylum reinforced these details in much more dramatic manner. But the horror shown on the screen was nothing compared to what really went down. Series like Ghost Adventures frame the location as emotionally reactive. Other shows such as Destination Fear and Paranormal Lockdown leaned into the endurance-based investigations. Overnight lockdowns emphasized how the buildings changed when observation stretches for hours. Paranormal Lockdown was able to capture a shadow figure in the back of their footage.
What the is that?
It's like, that's why I said it's like a snake.
Yeah.
I'm shaking right now just looking at it. You good? Here's.
While Destination Fear also revealed an unidentified figure flying past their screen while looking at a thermal camera. Beyond television, Trans-Allegheny has become a staple of long-form YouTube investigations. Independent creators frequently reference the asylum as a benchmark location, one that tests credibility because of how many people have already filmed there and how many have already caught evidence. Instead of trying to replicate earlier moments, many creators document personal reactions, extended silences, and unedited walkthroughs, with EVP sessions going off the charts. This has shifted the pop culture role of the asylum from spectacle to endurance appearance. Even ghost hunters return to Trans-Allegheny for their 200th investigation. Much like many of the other haunted places we have covered here on this podcast, legends surrounding Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum tend to focus less on spectacle and more on recognition. According to accounts shared by the site's current caretakers, there are several recurring presences that staff and visitors come to know over time rather than encounter once. Rebecca Jordan, whose family took ownership of the property, has described her earliest experience not as frightening but personal. During a tour, she felt a firm grip on her shoulder. Not aggressive, but unmistakably deliberate. Moments like that set the tone for how many describe the activity here. It feels interactive, aware, and responsive rather than random. Many investigators suggest that understanding what patients endured makes communication more likely. Not because the spirits are summoned, but because attention and empathy seem to invite response. The building contains areas where activity is reported consistently, suggesting that certain experiences may be tied to specific memories rather than roaming entities. The suffering that once occurred here did not vanish when the doors closed. It appears to have settled into the structure itself, just like Waverly Hills and Eastern State Penitentiary. And speaking of Waverly Hills, much like Timmy inside the sanatorium, Trans-Allegheny also has a childlike presence. On the 4th floor is a space commonly referred to as Lily's room. Visitors often describe seeing a young girl in a white dress with dark hair, and many leave toys or stuffed animals along the windowsill as an informal tribute. The room is frequently cited as one of the more active areas of the asylum, with reports that include a male presence said to linger near or behind the door, perhaps protecting Lily. What is less clear is who Lily actually was. One theory suggests the figure represents a young 9-year-old patient who passed away, while others claim a patient secretly gave birth within the asylum and the child's spirit never left. Neither account is supported by hospital records, leaving Lily's identity unresolved, but if you ever make the visit, you might just encounter her. One of the most frequently discussed locations is a room on the 3rd floor, known for seclusion cells, chaining patients to the wall and housing the most violent men, where a patient was killed by fellow inmates during a period of extreme overcrowding. They now call this Dean's room. Dean was a relatively calm 14-year-old who was sent to Trans-Allegheny after being accused of killing animals on his family farm. This room housed not only Dean but also 2 other inmates, James Woods, who is often referred to as Big Jim, and David Mason. What they did to Dean was absolutely reprehensible. They tied a sheet around Dean's neck, using it as a noose, and they would lift him off the ground just to the point where he was blue in the face. And then they would slowly bring him back down. But the fun for them ended when they propped the bedpost on top of Dean's face and jumped on the bed until it went straight through his skull. While they were both charged with murder, the duo remained at Trans-Allegheny to serve the remainder of their time. Big Jim is one of those entities named today and still roams the halls of Trans-Allegheny as an evil demonic spirit, just as he was during his time alive. The second floor contains what is often referred to as the most talked about room in the asylum, a small bathroom tied to one of its most violent incidents, if you could believe there was something more violent than Dean's death. According to records and later retellings, a patient made repeated sexual advances towards another patient. After being ignored multiple times, a butter knife was used to stab him 17 times. But he did not die in the bathroom. He collapsed and crawled his way into the hallway where he died, leaving the incident permanently associated with that section of the floor. This area is also linked to a figure commonly called the Sly Man. Witnesses describe a male presence that appears briefly, disappears, and is then reported elsewhere almost immediately. Some claim he could be experienced in multiple locations on the second floor at the same time, moving in ways that do not follow physical space or distance. The fourth floor is often cited as the area with the highest concentration of shadow figure reports. Visitors and investigators describe dark shapes moving along walls, crossing doorways, and appearing briefly before just vanishing. One presence in particular has earned the nickname the Creeper, described as a tall, thin figure that moves unnaturally, sometimes crawling up the walls and across ceilings rather than walking. This is where the footage from Paranormal Lockdown captured a slithering movement on this floor that many point to when discussing this reputation. Now, while the Creeper is also tied to Waverly Hills Sanatorium, many suspect that there is a portal tying these two haunted locations together. Now, Ward R carries its own weight. A woman once reported visible claw-like marks forming across her face while inside the ward, with no clear physical explanation. Others have described seeing a shadow figure framed in a window, rocking slowly back and forth as if seated just out of reach. These experiences tend to focus less on sound and more on visual awareness, the sense of something occupying a space where nothing should be. Room 13 can also be labeled as one of the most haunted rooms on the floor. The door is known to open and close on its own, sometimes repeatedly, even when no one is nearby. Whether these events are tied to a specific incident or to the cumulative history of the ward itself remains unclear. What stands out is how often different people, unaware of their stories, report the same movements and shapes in the same places. Now, we mentioned the torture, we mentioned the healing, but isolation rooms generate some of the most intense reactions. Staff historically had broad authority to place patients into seclusion, often under stressful and understaffed conditions. These rooms are now associated with physical sensations reported by visitors, including pressure, sudden anger, and the feeling of being shoved or scratched. Now, unlike Eastern State Penitentiary, there really aren't any famous names tied to Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, but one legend centers on a former boxer whose injuries left him volatile. During confinement, he reportedly tore a heavy metal door from its hinges, damaging the steel before calmly just handing it off to a nurse and returning to his room. The isolation spaces connected to this story often have reports of voices saying phrases like "get me out" or "let me go" with sudden temperature changes. Today, the asylum functions as a both historical site and paranormal destination, and as I mentioned before, tours are designed to educate, but the stories carry emotional weight that goes beyond dates and architecture. The contrast between the institution's original intent and the reality of what unfolded inside gives the legends their power. Visitors often describe sensations they can just not fully articulate. A chill without cold, a touch without a source, a sense that someone noticed them first. Trans-Allegheny does not present itself as a place of clear answers. Its legends are layered, sometimes contradictory, and often unresolved. What remains consistent is the impression that the building remembers. Whether those memories take form of spirits, residual energy, or psychological projection depends on who is listening. But few leave without feeling that the stories here are not finished being told. These stories are the echoes of lives once lived here, lingering in ways that history alone cannot capture. The story of Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum is one of stark contradictions, where intent and outcome rarely align. The Kirkbride philosophy emphasized light, fresh air, and the opportunity for patients to walk the grounds. Yet the reality of the institution's history diverged sharply from these ideals, and it happened fast. What was meant to heal frequently harmed. All of these contradictions underline a broader theme here. Good intentions alone were not enough to counter systematic failings in an institution where human needs vastly exceeded available resources. Social contradictions were equally present. The asylum was both a sanctuary and a cage, a place for the mentally ill yet housed people for reasons that were far from psychiatric. The line between illness and social conformity blurred, raising questions about who the institution served. The patients, or society's notion of order. Even in death, the asylum carries paradoxical echoes. Spirits, as reported by visitors and caretakers, are simultaneously playful, mournful, aggressive, and benign. Lily the child spirit embodies innocence preserved within the sight of suffering, while Dean's presence recalls violence and pain. The same walls that once promised reform now generate fear, empathy, and fascination. The building is at once a monument to care and a testament to failure. Ultimately, Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum embodies a duality that defines its legacy. Now, while mental reform was at the forefront, the regional and national politics of the time also played a big role in Trans-Allegheny. Funding and staffing were inconsistent, leaving caretakers overworked and underpaid, which compounded problems that were already beyond the structure. The asylum's isolation in rural West Virginia meant that the oversight was minimal, and the abuses, both intentional and systematic, went largely unchallenged. Once you were in, there was very little contact to the outside world. This geographic and bureaucratic isolation helped shape the extreme conditions that later fueled the hauntings and dark reputations of the facility, and overshadowed what the building was originally intended for. Another often overlooked layer is the humanity of the patients themselves. While the asylum's narrative emphasizes suffering, chaos, and cruelty, personal accounts reveal moments of connection, creativity, and resilience. Patients did form bonds. They celebrated holidays together and sometimes found ways to maintain a sense of identity despite the oppressive system. The treatment of women and children adds another dimension that is often understated. Pregnant women, mothers, and children were present, sometimes living their entire lives within the institution. Their experiences illustrate not only the failures of the asylum as a therapeutic space, but also how systematic neglect intersected with vulnerability, gender expectations, and societal judgment. Imagine being locked up because you read a book too fast. Finally, the post-closure history of Trans-Allegheny is often simplified to ghost stories or paranormal curiosity. What is overlooked here is the careful preservation work, research, and the educational programming that recontextualize this building. Tours and investigations provide insight into the broader history of mental health care, societal norms, and the ethical evolution of psychiatric treatment at the time, reminding visitors that the asylum's legacy is both spectral and profoundly human. These overlooked contexts deepen the story, revealing that the asylum was more than its walls or its horrors. It was a reflection of the society that created it, a complex intersection of care, control, and consequence. A visit to Trans-Allegheny often leaves more questions than answers. You may notice movement just outside your field of vision, hear footsteps where no one is walking, or feel a sudden shift in the air. Or you may experience nothing at all. Just floorboards settling, wind moving through broken windows, and the quiet weight of stone just filling the space. Every reaction is different, shaped by the building's architecture, its history, and the lives spent within its walls. Whether what people experience is presence, memory, or expectation is left unresolved. That uncertainty is what has earned Trans-Allegheny its reputation as one of the most haunted locations in America, not because of what it shows you, but because of what it leaves behind. In the next episode, the season finale, we board a vessel unlike any other, where the ghosts of the sea are said to walk the decks and the past drifts along the present. We'll explore the RMS Queen Mary, a ship whose elegance masks stories of tragedy, mystery, and lingering spirits. From the sounds of footsteps in the empty corridors to the shadows that vanish when approached, the Queen Mary reminds us that history doesn't always sail quietly. I'm Johnny Clash, and this is Paranormal Unsettled. Thanks for listening. When a place is designed to hold people until they break, the original concept and thought process behind the structure is left behind. This was not a place of healing or passage. It was a place of control, built on silence, solitude, and the belief that isolation could reform the human mind. The walls separated, the cells stripped identity, and the quiet did the rest. Sitting directly on the street in busy Philadelphia, this structure reads as a museum filled with history. But when the lights fade and the corridors empty, the space behaves differently. Sounds carry where it shouldn't, stillness feels deliberate, and the absence of people somehow feels crowded. This episode is not about spectacle or haunted house theatrics. It's about a system that asked men to sit alone for years with nothing but their own thoughts and what may have lingered after the doors finally opened. I'm Johnny Clash, a dad, a gamer, a former pro wrestler, and a lifelong observer of the unexplained. I'm not here to convince or dismiss. I'm here to listen, to document, and to sit with questions that do not resolve easily. This is Paranormal Unsettled. Eastern State Penitentiary is often described as a monument to punishment, but that framing only tells part of the story. It was built to correct behavior by breaking habits through psychological torture. Solitude was intended to lead to reflection, and reflection to reform. Instead, it produced a place where time slowed, voices vanished, and identity eroded. I'm not approaching this location as a virtual visitor looking for spectacle. Much of Eastern State is not even safe to explore. I'm approaching it with the focus on what happens to the human mind when a person is left alone for months or even years. This is a solid structure shaped by long overnight shifts, guards pacing empty cell blocks, and the routine management of hundreds, sometimes thousands, of prisoners meant to be unseen and unheard. The building absorbed those rhythms, the pauses, the waiting, the repetition. This history may become uncomfortable as we examine a system that believed prolonged isolation and other forms of torture were humane. Eastern State does not shout its story. The longer you listen, the harder it becomes to separate documented history from whatever still seems to linger within its walls. To set the stage, Eastern State Penitentiary opened in 1829 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, as one of the most ambitious social experiments in American history. Designed around the Pennsylvania system, a radical philosophy held that solitude and silence would lead prisoners to reflect on their crimes and reform. Unlike early prisons focused on public punishment, Eastern State aimed to be orderly, controlled, and moral. Its existence represented a shift in how society addressed crime. The architecture was revolutionary. A radial layout extended cell blocks outwards like the spokes from a central hub. Guards could observe multiple wings from a single point while keeping prisoners in check. Each cell was for one inmate only, a concept uncommon at the time. The prison drew visitors from around the world, including writers, politicians, and prison reformers. It was a model and an example. But prisoners spent nearly all of their time alone in cells, around 23 hours a day, eating, sleeping, working, and just reflecting. They wore hoods when they were moved to prevent seeing or being seen by others. Even names were just replaced by numbers. The goal was complete separation from outside temptation. Every single piece of your identity was stripped away. Despite reformative intent, the system revealed its psychological toll. Many inmates suffered severe mental health issues, including anxiety, hallucinations. Some even lose their ability to speak normally. Observers began to question whether solitude corrected behavior or quietly destroyed those subjected to it, and the proof was there. But deep inside of what was believed to be the world's first penitentiary, isolation wasn't the only form of punishment here, with some other methods and sometimes death. The iron gag, for example, was used on inmates who spoke when they weren't supposed to. In 1833, Matthias Macumsey, serving time for manslaughter, tried to talk to his neighbor in the adjacent cell. Guards bound his hands behind his back, placed a cast iron gag over his tongue attached to the shackles, and left him. An hour later, he was found dead with his tongue ripped out and bleeding. Sorry for the graphic details. Other punishments were equally cruel. The mad chair, designed to restrict all movement, forced inmates to sit so tightly strapped that it was literally impossible to move. Some endured days in the chair without food, causing blood flow restrictions that often led to bodily damage or even the need for amputations. The water bath was another cruel punishment, particularly in the winter. Inmates who broke rules could be dunked in ice-cold water and then hung on the wall all night. Now, frigid temperatures would freeze the skin before morning, and many did not survive. Now, by the mid-19th century, criticism grew. Charles Dickens, the author of A Christmas Carol, Oliver Twist, and Great Expectations, toured Eastern State and later wrote harshly about the psychological damage that he witnessed on his trip. Other prisons adopted alternative methods, emphasizing labor and limited interaction rather than total isolation. Eastern State continued largely unchanged for decades, somehow just sweeping it all under the rug. Overcrowding eventually eroded original principles here at Eastern State. Cells designed for one sometimes held 2 or more inmates. The strict silence rules were relaxed. What began as a controlled experiment gradually became a more conventional prison, though the architecture and atmosphere remained oppressive. What once held 400 inmates was now housing thousands. Harsh disciplinary methods added to the contradictions. Prisoners breaking rules could be confined in dark underground cells with little air or light. These practices contradicted the prison's moral mission and fueled public concern. The gap between intention and reality widened. By the early 20th century, Eastern State was considered outdated. Modern corrections philosophy moved away from extreme isolation. The aging facility required constant maintenance, and in 1971, after more than 140 years, it officially closed. Remaining inmates were transferred elsewhere and the building was left abandoned. For years it sat in decay. Nature crept in, paint peeled, silence returned in a different form. The prison became a haunting reminder of past ideals and consequences. Its empty corridors preserved architecture and emotional weight alike. Today, Eastern State is studied as both an architectural landmark and cautionary tale. It tells a story of control, reform, and unintended harm. History here does not feel distant but suspended, asking visitors to confront what happens when isolation is mistaken for healing. Now, the shift towards paranormal interpretation did not happen all at once. For decades after closure, Eastern State was viewed primarily as a failed social experiment and decaying historical site. It's not hard to miss either. If you drive up Fairmount Avenue, there it is, right on the street, looking like a castle sticking out like a sore thumb. But the abandonment of the building changed its perception entirely. The empty cell blocks and infirmary, echoes of wind through broken windows all create an atmosphere that invited emotional reactions. Visitors described feeling watched, unsettled, or uneasy long before the ghost stories emerged. In the late 20th century, pop culture began framing historical trauma through narrative and sensation. Haunted locations offered a way to process difficult histories. Eastern State fit neatly into this narrative. It was old, imposing, and tied to suffering. Stories didn't need invention. The emotional weight already existed. Television amplified the transformation. Paranormal TV shows featured Eastern State as rich with potential evidence. Dark hallways, crumbling cells, the strange sounds made compelling visuals. Focus slowly shifted from why the prison failed to what might still remain. The public tours adapted. Historical interpretations remained central, but guides referenced cold spots, shadow figures, and disembodied sounds. Guests drew their own conclusions. Education and mystery coexisted, shaping the site's identity forever. Now, Halloween events cemented the paranormal reputation. Along with the belief that something was still inside of Eastern State, there was always skepticism, much like any haunted location. Some argued that the environment and expectation explained the sensation of others. This tension between belief and doubt added some complexity rather than resolution. But Eastern State's paranormal identity now exists alongside its historical one. Ultimately, the shift is not about proof but attention. Eastern State reacts to visitors. The paranormal lens offers engagement with unanswered questions. Modern audiences shape the story as much as the prison itself. Now let's get to it, because we have not mentioned his name yet, but the most enduring name tied to Eastern State is Al Capone. Though he served only a short sentence there in 1929, alongside famous bank robbers such as Slick Willie Sutton and Bill Miner, his presence was permanently altered how the prison is remembered. Unlike the majority of inmates who endured extreme conditions, Capone occupied a private cell furnished with rugs, paintings, a cabinet radio, and better lighting. This contrast became symbolic. It highlighted inequality inside the walls and reinforced the idea that power could bend even the most rigid system. Capone's cell has since become the most visited and photographed space in the prison. Visitors report a strange energy there, including unexplained noises, sudden temperature changes, and feelings of uneasy. Paranormal investigators often focus their sessions in this cell, not because Capone suffered the most. He didn't even die there. He was barely in this cell. But because the legacy carries weight. The cell represents corruption and privilege and the illusion of control inside a system designed to strip identity away. And for the Boardwalk Empire fans who are familiar with Stephen Graham's portrayal of Al Capone, his co-star Steve Buscemi actually narrates the popular Voices of Eastern State audio tour on premise today. Now let's get back to the paranormal television shows. During their investigation of Eastern State Penitentiary, the Ghost Adventures crew documented what they believed to be some of the most intense paranormal activity of their careers. Throughout the lockdown, they captured multiple EVPs that appear to be direct and intelligent, including the words hungry, I knew God, hi, Nick, and a clear warning of get out. Alongside the voices, the team records disturbing residual noises such as doors opening, scratching sounds, heavy footsteps, and screaming echoes throughout the cell blocks with no visible source. One of the most alarming moments occurs when a man's scream is heard and the camera immediately loses power, which the crew interprets as a sudden energy drain. Visually, Aaron reports seeing a shadow figure standing at the end of the cell block, though it's not captured on the digital still camera. Later, using that same camera, the team photographs a mist emerging from the glowing doorway, which Zach suggests may represent an apparition or a doorway to the other side. By the end of the episode, the crew concludes that the prison's history of isolation and suffering has left behind a powerful and oppressive energy, solidifying Eastern State Penitentiary as one of the most haunted locations they have ever investigated. But now, in one of the early seasons of Ghost Hunters, the crew also investigated Eastern State, and captured some captivating evidence which appears to be a person standing up, turning quickly, and walking away. They tried to recreate it, but the evidence puzzled the crew so much that they returned for a second investigation later that night and personally captured some shadow figures as well as some voice anomalies. But now, television isn't the only form of media using Eastern State as its focal point. The prison served as a filming location for the movie 12 Monkeys, a post-apocalyptic science fiction thriller. Now, one of the largest cultural influences came from Terror Behind the Walls, the massive Halloween attraction hosted at Eastern State for years. While entirely staged, it introduced millions of visitors to the prison. Capone's image often appears in promotional material and tour dialogue, adding a familiar face to the bone-chilling history. Outside of media production, some of the most compelling stories come from staff and preservation workers. These accounts include hearing music, voices, and footsteps during overnight shifts, especially near Capone's cell, which is still furnished despite a fresh coat of paint to this day. Whether coincidence or expectation, these experiences continue to reinforce the idea that the prison holds emotional residue tied to its most famous inmate. Now, while Capone's stay was brief, it was able to expose cracks in the system and give the prison a face that audiences could recognize. Capone did not need to suffer to leave a mark. His name alone was enough. Now, while Capone did not exactly suffer the same way the other inmates do, there was no torture involved. One of the most chilling stories tied to Eastern State and Capone is that of Jimmy Clark, a low-ranking mobster killed during the St. Valentine's Day massacre. It is said that Capone felt Jimmy sharing his cell, hearing him in the night, speaking to him when no one else was there. Fellow inmates and guards sometimes reported Capone screaming or quietly conversing with an unseen presence. Even after his release, the haunting reportedly followed him to Alcatraz, and even to his estate in Palm Island. Capone's fear of Jimmy's spirit became so intense that his bodyguards would rush to his room, convinced that he was under attack, only to find him alone and terrified. Could Jimmy be the one still lingering back in Capone's cell today? As I mentioned before, some notable bank robbers were also housed in Eastern State. Slick Willie Sutton, known as the Actor, was a gentleman in appearance but ruthless in practice. Sentenced for a high-profile bank robbery in 1934, Sutton attempted multiple escapes from Eastern State, including one in 1945 through a tunnel with 11 other inmates. Unfortunately for them, they broke through to the other side during the day and were spotted immediately by a patrol car and captured. Then there's Victor Babe Andreoli, convicted of murdering a Pennsylvania State Police officer. Sent to Eastern State for life, he escaped in 1943 but was ultimately caught and killed in a diner, declaring he would never be taken alive. Some would rather live with their head on a swivel than sustain what Eastern State Penitentiary would put them through. The women of Eastern State left their spectral traces as well. Frida Frost, convicted of murdering her husband by poisoning him, was the last female prisoner, transferred in 1923. Her departure marked the end of an era, but some believe her spirit still lingers, particularly in areas formerly occupied by female inmates, carrying whispers of vengeance, sorrow, and regret. But the hauntings are not only tied to famous names. The very architecture of Eastern State seems to hold memory. Cell Block 4 is known for shadow figures and faces appearing in the corridors, sometimes beckoning visitors closer. Locksmith Gary Johnson, tasked with replacing locks, felt an overwhelming unseen force. He saw distorted faces lining the walls and sensed energy so intense it seemed almost alive, leaping at him from nowhere. Cell Block 12 is a hotspot for disembodied voices, whispers, cackles, and footsteps that cannot be traced. Even seasoned investigators report an overwhelming sense of dread when entering, sometimes accompanied by flickering lights or equipment malfunctions. Some describe feeling touched or scratched by something unseen, as if the suffering of decades has crystallized into presence that cannot move on. Cell Block 6 is haunted by darting shadows along the walls, leaving staff refusing to enter alone at night, reporting black silhouettes gliding down the corridor straight out of the Hogwarts Great Hall. And above, in the upper tiers, lurks the silent observer. A presence that watches from above, felt rather than seen. Visitors describe subtle pressures or the sensation of being followed, adding to the penitentiary's reputation as a place that remembers everyone who has passed through its walls. Even the prison's design seems to amplify the creepy. Narrow corridors, high ceilings, and echoing stone distort sound and depth perception. Metal walkways carry footsteps unnaturally, creating echoes that appear to come from nowhere, but with the sound that travels deep. Occasional childlike giggles or whispers appear in areas that never house children, adding to the unpredictability. But don't worry, parents. Eastern State holds a scavenger hunt for children right on their grounds today. The building itself is an innocent witness to all of the horrible things, carrying memory in stone and iron. Eastern State does not give answers, it gives fragments, and it is those fragments that makes the penitentiary eternally unsettled. Eastern State Penitentiary is not about proving what exists nor debunking it. It's about observing what remains, noticing the spaces where experiences fails to align with reason, and exploring what persists when stories, history, and expectation collide. Here, the unexplained is not a flaw. It is a feature, and it's precisely what makes the penitentiary what it is today, and it allows these questions to be asked with no real answer. Now, much like Waverly Hills, one of the most overlooked aspects of Eastern State Penitentiary is how long it functioned as an active prison compared to its relatively brief life as just a haunted, abandoned location. For more than a century, the rigid routines, schedules, and procedures shaped the environment far more than the sensational incidents that now dominate paranormal lore. The architecture, the weight of the stone walls, and the long echoing corridors that were built for discipline and surveillance, rather than fear, now amplify unease in the imaginations of visitors, much like many aging Gothic structures whose original purpose has been lost to time. While Eastern State housed death row inmates, executions were not carried out on site. There is no complete tally of deaths, but the number of inmates who died from disease, neglect, or psychological and physical abuse likely contributes to its reputation. The absence of precise records leaves room for speculation, allowing tragedy to blur into myth. With its three distinct identities as a functioning prison, an abandoned structure, and eventually a tourist attraction, Eastern State has been repeatedly redefined. Each transformation altered how the building was remembered. Paranormal claims are often attributed entirely to its years as an active prison, even when many reported experiences occurred decades later, long after the routines and lives that once defined the space had disappeared. Sure, you might take a tour and catch a shadow, hear a footstep echo, or feel a chill run down your spine. Or maybe you'll notice just the wind whistling through broken windows or the stone settling under its own weight. Most haunted spots lose their edge once the scares become predictable. Eastern State doesn't. We want explanations, names, and causes. Instead, we get fragments. We get Al Capone and the other infamous names that have come through the Eastern State walls. You get a figure glimpsed in a corridor, a story repeated on a tour by Steve Buscemi. Pieces that make the experience easier to talk about, but never fully explain. Beyond those fragments lie moments that refuse to be neat, experiences that resist a tidy story, but they leave the question open. This place doesn't need one defining ghost or mobster to feel alive. Time, architecture, the torture that was here, and the people who walk the halls today hoping to see or feel something are enough. The same space doesn't behave the same for everyone, and that unpredictability is exactly what keeps this legend alive. In the next episode, we remain in confinement, but this time, it's a place where sanity and suffering walk side by side. A place where human endurance was pushed to its absolute limits, and the echoes of that struggle still linger. Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. I'm Johnny Clash, and this is Paranormal Unsettled. Thanks for listening. Some ships are built to carry passengers. Others are built to carry stories. The Queen Mary was conceived as a floating palace, a symbol of elegance, progress, and the pinnacle of luxury travel. Polished wood replaced rough decks. Grand ballrooms replaced cramped quarters, and the hum of engines replaced silence. Yet beneath the gilded corridors, history left marks far deeper than the brass fittings and fine fabrics could conceal. This episode is not about theatrical scares or staged encounters. It is about a vessel that has carried lives, tragedies, and secrets, and the ways that human presence and absence have left an imprint that defies explanation. Accounts from crews, passengers, and visitors suggest the Queen Mary is more than just steel and wood. It is a witness to its own history. I'm Johnny Clash, a dad, a gamer, a former pro wrestler, and a lifelong observer of the unexplained. I'm not here to convince or dismiss. I'm here to document, to listen, and to stay with questions that do not resolve neatly. This is Paranormal Unsettled. The Queen Mary is often described as a luxury ocean liner, yet that label only scratches the surface. It was a marvel of engineering, a floating city designed for comfort, safety, and prestige. Its mission was grandeur, but its experience was shaped by tragedy, human error, and the weight of history. I'm not approaching this ship as a tourist. I'm approaching it as a vessel shaped by repeated departures and arrivals, by accidents, by lives lost at sea, and the echoes of those who never disembarked. This episode is not focused on proving ghosts exist. It's about examining what happens when human activity, emotion, and tragedy accumulate in a place designed to endure. The Queen Mary does not tell its story loudly. It whispers it. Through unexplained phenomena, through history, and through the lingering impressions of those who pay attention. Most importantly, it shows how the identity of a place can forever alter the course of its history. The RMS Queen Mary was launched in 1934 and entered service in 1936 as a British ocean liner for the Cunard Line. Named after the Queen Mary herself, it was the largest and fastest passenger ship in the world at the time, capable of crossing the Atlantic in record time. The ship was designed as a pinnacle of luxury travel with Art Deco interiors, expansive stair rooms, and lavish public spaces. Its decks were built to accumulate promenades, grand ballrooms, dining salons, and lounges, creating an atmosphere of elegance and sophistication that attracted celebrities, dignitaries, and royalty. For many passengers, a voyage on the Queen Mary represented both status and the promise of adventure. From the beginning, the ship was a marvel of engineering. Almost 2 times the mass of the Titanic, it measured over 1,000 feet in length, with gross tonnage exceeding 81,000 tons. Triple screw steam turbines powered this vessel, enabling speeds over 30 knots. The Queen Mary was not only luxurious but also technically advanced with stabilizers to reduce rolling, cutting-edge navigation systems, and extensive safety measures for the time. Every detail of the ship's construction was intended to convey both prestige and reliability, a combination that made it the jewel of the Cunard Line fleet. The outbreak of World War II in 1939 dramatically changed the ship's trajectory. Converted into a troop transport, the Queen Mary was painted gray and nicknamed the Ghost Gray for its ability to evade enemy submarines and U-boats. It carried 800,000 total servicemen across the Atlantic, often under extreme risk. Cabins originally intended for luxury passengers were converted into crowded bunk spaces. The ship's corridors, once the setting for formal gatherings, became thoroughfares for soldiers moving at all hours. Despite these modifications, the Queen Mary retained elements of its original grandeur, providing rare moments of comfort amidst wartime service. But during the war, the Queen Mary's decks and compartments bore witness to both camaraderie and tragedy. Accidents occurred during hurried loading and unloading, and at least a dozen crew and soldiers reportedly lost their lives on board during wartime operations. Stories from the period describe sudden deaths from falls or machinery, as well as reports of sailors and troops who vanished without clear explanation. These incidents contributed to the vessel's long reputation for harboring the echoes of those who never left its decks. Now, on October 2nd, 1942, the Queen Mary was sailing from New York to Glasgow, carrying troops across the Atlantic. Ahead of her, the HMS Coraco zigzagged to evade enemy bombers. But the Queen Mary, a ship 20 times the size, collided with the smaller vessel, slicing it in half. Some crew were killed instantly, others thrown into the icy water, facing deaths by hypothermia or the ship's spinning propellers. The Queen could not stop and pressed onwards. By the time the British arrived, most were gone. Out of 430 crew members, only 99 survived. Today, some say you could still hear their screams echoing through the boiler rooms of the Queen Mary itself. Tragedy followed the ship, but after World War II, the ship was refurbished and returned to civilian service on the transatlantic route. Its Art Deco interiors were restored and public spaces reopened for formal events, dances, and fine dining. High-profile passengers once again sailed on its decks, and the Queen Mary became synonymous with post-war luxury travel. However, the vessel's wartime past remained an indelible part of its character. Crew and passengers reported fires, mechanical failures, and unexpected accidents, some of which became the foundation for early ghost stories surrounding the ship. Even during its civilian years, incidents of unexplained activity were reported. Crew quarters were occasionally found in disarray, with doors left open or objects moved without explanation. Passengers sometimes reported hearing footsteps in empty hallways or the sound of a child crying in the distance. While many of these occurrences were dismissed as imagination or structural noises, they helped lay the groundwork for the ship's modern reputation as a paranormal hotspot. By 1967, the Queen Mary was permanently retired from the transatlantic services and permanently moored in Long Beach, California. Its conversion into a hotel and tourist attraction allows the public to explore both the grandeur and the hidden corners of the ship. Engine rooms, crew areas, and staterooms once bustled with activity became part of curated tours, giving visitors a glimpse of both luxury and hardship. The ship's preserved spaces, grand ballrooms, wide promenades, and private cabins serve as tangible reminders of its dual identity as both a vessel of opulence and a site of human struggle. Today, the Queen Mary functions as both a historical monument and a center for paranormal exploration, but its reputation for hauntings rivals the most famous locations in the world, with reports of ghostly apparitions, cold spots, and disembodied voices attracting investigators, tourists, and enthusiasts. But you know, if you stayed in the Queen Mary, it's highly likely you've seen something that doesn't belong. The Queen Mary's identity shifted dramatically once it left active service. From a symbol of transatlantic luxury and engineering prowess, it became a stationary attraction, a vessel whose past could be explored on foot rather than experienced at sea. No longer transporting the wealthy and famous across oceans, the ship's focus changed from motion and service to story and atmosphere. Its grand ballrooms, once alive with music and conversation, now echo with footsteps of visitors and guides recounting tales of tragedy, accidents, and unexplained events. In this way, the Queen Mary evolved into a place where history, imagination, and legend converge, a destination as much about perception as architecture. Media coverage further solidified this reputation. Features in magazines, travel shows, and historical documentaries often highlighted the ship's dual identity, a site of luxury and death. Seasonal events like Halloween tours and overnight ghost experience drew on both its history and supernatural lore, creating a blend of education and suspense, much like we saw with Eastern State Penitentiary. These portrayals emphasized that the Queen Mary was not merely a relic to be observed, but a stage where human emotion and memory continued to interact with physical space. Online platforms expanded the ship's spectral identity even further. YouTube walkthroughs, paranormal reaction videos, and live-streamed investigations allowed a global audience to experience the Queen Mary virtually. These creators often focused less on documented history and more on the sensation it evoked. Sudden chills, fleeting shadows, and the unnerving awareness of being watched. Viewers were encouraged to interpret the atmosphere themselves, making the ship a collaborative space for storytelling and imagination across generations. Today, the Queen Mary is kept alive through repeated engagement, tours, events, media features, and investigations, continually reintroducing it to audiences, ensuring that each visitor experiences something unique. The ship invites reflection on human achievement, tragedy, and the unknown, blending education and eerie fascination with a singular experience. In this way, the Queen Mary is both a monument to maritime history and enduring canvas for curiosity and even fear. Now, the Queen Mary has become a recurring fixture in paranormal media, portrayed not just as a haunted location, but as a vessel with its own active presence. Shows like Ghost Adventures emphasize its interactive qualities, capturing long static shots, EVPs, and sudden auditory events. Hosts and crew consistently reported a sense of being observed, footsteps echoing in empty corridors, and the doors opening without explanation, highlighting the ship's unpredictable and responsive energy. They also witnessed multiple orbs of light floating around and saw an apparition of John Petter, who was an 18-year-old crew member on the Queen Mary who died tragically on July 10th of 1966, near door 13. Now here's a piece of evidence that is kind of mind-blowing, and it's also my favorite, though not necessarily paranormal. During Ghost Hunters' investigation aboard the RMS Queen Mary, one of the most debated moments involved the bedsheets moving in room B340. As the team conducted their walkthrough, the sheets appeared to shift and pull downward as if something or someone had tugged on them. The crew initially reacted as though they captured something compelling, something amazing, something they've never seen before. It was too good to be true. However, when the footage was reviewed more closely, more questions emerged. The door to the room had been propped open during parts of the investigation, leaving the possibility of human interference with more than one way to enter the room. Even more striking, a detailed look at the tape reveals what appears to be a pause in the recording, followed by the audible beep of the camera resuming. This raised suspicions that the bedding may have been physically manipulated between recordings. Speculation swirled about who could be responsible. Some pointed towards the staff, but the TAPS team stated they did not believe it was the Queen Mary's employees, because why would they do that? Why would they risk that? With hundreds of guests staying aboard that night, the number of variables was significant. Notably, no supporting thermal or audio evidence was captured to validate the sheet movement. Only some weird blips in the camera that just didn't make sense. The team did document lights turning on and off during their overnight stay, but the sheet incident remains one of the most controversial moments of that episode. The full investigation can be found on Ghost Hunters' YouTube channel, Season 2, Episode 11. See it for yourself. Now, along the lines of the lights flickering for the TAPS team, BuzzFeed's Unsolved watched a sink turn on, toothbrush bags move right before their eyes, and the feeling of poking on their cheek in the middle of the night.
That night when I slept, I was repeatedly poked in the face. I discovered to my horror that he was actually fast asleep and snoring.
YouTubers Sam and Colby claim that this is the most haunted location that made them believers of the paranormal, and upon returning to the Queen Mary for another investigation, they held a conversation using a REM pod, which is a popular ghost hunting tool that detects changes in electromagnetic field, only to have all of their footage wiped away from the SD card. But cultural engagement has extended beyond television and online media. Podcasts, travel blogs, social media threads frequently revisit the ship's stories, linking personal experience with the historical accounts and reported hauntings. Visitors share first-hand accounts of footsteps echoing in the empty corridors, laughs from unseen children, and the sensation of being touched by unseen presences. Travel documentaries and seasonal media also reinforce the Queen Mary's dual identity. Across television, streaming, and online platforms, the Queen Mary has emerged as a cultural touchstone for both historical reflection and paranormal storytelling. Its legend is sustained not through a single story or event, but through ongoing engagement. Visitors and viewers alike are reminded that the Queen Mary is never static. Its past and its perceived presence continue to evolve with every exploration. Much like the other haunted locations we've covered here on Season 1, the Queen Mary is host to a wide array of reported spirits, each connected to different chapters of the ship's long history. Crew, staff, and visitors alike have described ghostly apparitions and disembodied voices in empty corridors. Some of the most frequently mentioned include a sailor who tragically died in a boiler room accident during wartime service, as well as passengers who met untimely ends in staterooms, stairwells, or on the ship's decks. These spirits are not confined to one area. They appear in multiple locations, suggesting a presence tied to the vessel itself, rather than isolated events. The Queen Mary's history holds stories of sudden and tragic deaths among her crew. In 1936, her first captain, Sir Edgar Britton, suffered a fatal stroke in his cabin. Years later, in 1949, Senior Second Officer William Stark died after drinking laundry detergent that had been stored in a gin bottle. The poison was disguised as a drink, and it said the captain had encouraged him to have a sip. Whether he knew which gin he was giving his officer remains unclear to this day. Now back to John Petter. In 1966, he was an 18-year-old crewman who tragically was crushed by Door 13, an automatic watertight door, during a routine safety drill. The incident left a lasting mark on the ship, and over the years, crew and visitors have reported seeing a ghostly figure in the same area, dressed in white coveralls, the uniform that the young sailor would have been wearing. This apparition is often described as moving silently through the corridors, a somber reminder of the dangers faced, even in routine procedures. Door 13 has been the site of unexplained footsteps, whispers, and a sense of someone descending or ascending when no one is present. Cabin B340, one of the most infamous rooms aboard the ship, and the one mentioned earlier in the Ghost Hunters controversy, is said to be haunted by a woman who died under mysterious circumstances. Guests report sudden cold spots, the feeling of being watched, and occasionally seeing a figure move across the room before vanishing. The Lady in White is another enduring legend. Sightings describe a figure in a flowing white dress gliding through corridors, often near staterooms where passengers experience misfortune. Some claim she is searching for someone lost or trapped. The figure is generally not considered threatening, but her presence is a reminder of the ship's storied and sometimes tragic past. The first-class swimming pool, once a place of leisure and glamour, is said to carry echoes of laughter alongside dark memories. 2 women from different eras drowned here, one in the 1930s, the other decades later, and witnesses report seeing apparitions in period clothing drifting along the pool's edge. A little boy who fell overboard is said to haunt the nearby passageways, while a little girl named Jackie lingers around the swimming areas, her presence felt in splashes and fleeting shadows. Even when the pool is empty, it seems to remember every life touched by its waters. Now, the engine room and the boiler rooms, where several crew members lost their lives during the aforementioned HMS Coraco accident, continue to report hearing echoes of that event. Voices shouting, footsteps running across decks, and the faint sounds of panic or commands being issued. These experiences tie the ship's hauntings directly to its historical tragedies, reinforcing the link between memory and residual energy. But one of the most grim deaths aboard the Queen Mary occurred during World War II, when a cook was reportedly shoved into an oven. His screams are said to still echo through the ship's kitchen, lingering long after the ovens have gone cold. Now, while some spirits aboard the Queen Mary are associated with death and misfortune, others appear more playful or benign. Guests have reported figures that seem curious, shadows that move along corridors without aggression, and sensations of being gently guided rather than harmed. Much like the Trans-Allegheny lunatic asylum, the Queen Mary's hauntings are closely tied to the lives of those who inhabited it. The ship's legends are nuanced, reflecting a history of opulence, labor, tragedy, and memory, rather than serving purely as sensationalized tales. While these tales are enough to send shivers down your spine, there's a way to explore the Queen Mary without facing the terror of being alone after dark. Each fall, the Queen Mary and the surrounding harbor transform into the Dark Harbor, a massive Halloween festival packed with Halloween mazes, hundreds of monsters, immersive attractions, live entertainment, VIP experience, theme bars and lounges, carnival rides, festive eats and treats, and endless Instagram-worthy moments. Now, many visitors are drawn to the Queen Mary by its reputation for hauntings, but the ship's story encompasses far more than ghostly legends. Its service during World War II as the Grey Ghost illustrates not only the scale of military logistics, but also the courage and resilience of those who sailed under extreme pressure. Transporting tens of thousands of soldiers across the Atlantic required meticulous planning, advanced engineering, and unflinching discipline. And the human cost of that effort left lasting marks on the vessel's history. The ship's design and construction also offer fascinating insights into early 20th century engineering and maritime ambition. At the time of its launch, the Queen Mary was a marvel of naval architecture, blending luxury and speed in a way few ships had before. The opulence of first-class accommodations, combined with the mechanical ingenuity of its engines and hull, reflected both technological progress and social stratification, highlighting the stark contrast between passengers and experiences. Social history aboard the Queen Mary adds another layer to its legacy. Transatlantic travel in the 30s and 40s was a highly ritualized experience with strict class division, elaborate etiquette, and cultural performance embedded in every voyage. The ship carried not only celebrities and royalty, but also ordinary travelers seeking new opportunities, making it a microcosm of society at the time. The excitement, joy, and occasional tension aboard these voyages left impressions that some say linger in the vessel's atmosphere. Crew experiences provide further context, revealing the daily realities of life aboard a massive ocean liner. Long hours, cramped quarters, and high-stress duties created an environment in which mistakes, accidents, and interpersonal tensions were inevitable. Boiler room workers, engine staffs, stewards, and deck halls all faced intense demands, and these pressures sometimes contributed to tragic incidents, injuries, and deaths. Just think of that poor chef. Recognizing these human factors helps explain why certain areas of the ship, like the engine room or the stairwells, have become focal points of paranormal accounts. Even beyond specific events, the Queen Mary embodies broader lessons about human ambition, mortality, and memory. It's a floating archive of lives intersecting, passengers seeking leisure or adventure, sailors performing duties under duress, and soldiers transported through perilous waters. The stories of joy, hardship, and loss are layered throughout the decks, creating a complex emotional and historical landscape. By considering both the documented history and the reported hauntings, visitors should approach the Queen Mary with a more nuanced perspective. The Queen's reputation for unexplained is inseparable from its past, and appreciating the human experience behind the legend deepens understanding. It is a reminder that even in places famed for ghosts, the living history, the engineering, the labor, the society is as compelling as any apparition. A visit to the Queen Mary may leave you with more questions than answers. You might hear footsteps in an empty hallway, see movement from the corner of your eye, or feel a sudden chill. Or you might notice nothing at all, the ship settling in its berth, the wind across the decks, or the ambient sound of a vessel built to endure. With that, we close Season 1. We've journeyed through isolation, confinement, and the echoes of human experience left behind in the spaces we've explored. Season 2 will return with even more unsettling stories, this time focusing on figures in history who have been misunderstood, misrepresented, or forgotten completely. We'll uncover the lives, legacies, and lingering presence of those whose stories deserve to be heard, and perhaps still have something to say. We will see you for Season 2 in April, and I'm Johnny Clash, and this... Wait, you thought we were done? Next week, we're gonna drop a bonus episode where we journey to the eastern tip of Long Island, to a place where conspiracy and coastline collide. We will explore the legend of the Montauk Project, a story of Cold War paranoia, alleged mind control experiments, missing time, and whispers of something far more unsettling. Once again, I'm Johnny Clash, and this is Paranormal Unsettled. Some stories refuse to stay buried, not because they are proven, but because they sit too close to things we already know are true. They brush against reality in ways that make us uneasy, forcing us to question what really happened, and what we are willing to accept as possible. The Montauk Project is one of those stories. It's a place, a program, and a collection of claims that exist in the gray space between documented history and whispered testimony. Here, what we know and what we think we know are not far apart. They overlap, they twist and turn, and sometimes contradict each other in ways that are impossible to ignore. This is a story about experiments and electromagnetic frequencies, about time, memory, and human consciousness pushed to its absolute limits. It's about creatures, shadows, and phenomena that defy explanation, lurking in the corners of memory and imagination. This is the Montauk Project, and within it are the strange things, the impossible events, and the lingering mysteries that refuse to let go. I'm Johnny Clash. I'm a dad, a gamer, a former pro wrestler, and a lifelong observer of the unexplained. I'm not here to persuade belief or disbelief. I'm here to document, to listen, and to stay with questions that do not resolve neatly. This is Paranormal Unsettled. At the far eastern edge of Long Island, where land gives way to open Atlantic water, sits a stretch of coastline shaped by wind, fog, and isolation. Montauk is quiet by design, and it always has been. For decades, one structure dominated this landscape. A concrete radar tower rising above the cliffs, a military installation known as Camp Hero. From the outside, Camp Hero looked like what it claimed to be. A coastal defense site, a relic of war. Inside the story, however, it becomes something else entirely. something may be familiar. A place where secrecy thickened over time, where the purpose shifted, where memory, technology, and fear allegedly intersected. What follows is not a verdict. It's a reconstruction of how the Montauk Project came to exist as a legend, but who built it, who carried it forward, and why it still lingers. Camp Hero was established during World War II as part of the coastal defense system meant to detect enemy aircraft and naval threats approaching the eastern seaboard. Its radar systems were considered advanced for their time and positioned deliberately at one of the most strategic points along the coast. The base operated under strict military control and was largely inaccessible to civilians. After the war ended, Camp Hero did not close. Instead, like many military installations, it adapted. The Cold War reframed national priorities, and surveillance replaced defense. Radar technology evolved rapidly, and Camp Hero remained active well into the 1960s. Official records describe Camp Hero as a radio station and communications hub, nothing more. But secrecy surrounding Cold War research across the country, especially projects tied to psychological warfare, signal manipulation, and behavioral control. This context matters because it laid the groundwork for stories like Montauk to take root. The modern Montauk Project narrative begins primarily with a man named Preston Nichols. Without Nichols, there is no Montauk Project as it's commonly understood today. He's not simply a contributor to the story. He is the story. He's the foundation. Nichols claimed to be an engineer who worked at Camp Hero during the late 1970s and early 1980s, brought in for his technical expertise and gradually exposed to projects that, according to him, went far beyond conventional military research. Nichols described Camp Hero as a facility that had quietly shifted purpose. On the surface, it remained a decommissioned or minimally active radar station. Behind that appearance, he claimed it was repurposed for experiments involving electromagnetic frequencies, human consciousness, and behavioral control. According to Nichols, much of this work was compartmentalized, meaning individuals involved rarely understood the full scope of what they were participating in. Central to Nichols' claim was the radar tower itself. He stated that the structure was not simply broadcasting signals outward into the Atlantic, but was also capable of directing electromagnetic energy inward towards human subjects. These frequencies, he claimed, could influence perception, suppress or alter memory, and even implant thoughts, mind control. In this account, the human brain was treated as a receiver, no different from a radio or radar system, capable of being tuned, disrupted, or even overwritten. Now, Nichols argued that this research was an extension of Cold War psychological warfare. He often referenced real government programs that explored behavioral influence, including experiments involving hypnosis, drugs, and sensory deprivation. In this context, electromagnetic mind influence was presented not as fantasy, but as the next logical step in controlling perception without physical force. As his story developed, Nichols began describing increasingly extreme outcomes. He claimed that the interaction between technology and human consciousness produced unintended effects. And according to him, emotional states, subconscious fears, and mental imagery could bleed into reality when amplified by the equipment at Camp Hero. This idea later became central to the stories involving the Montauk Chair and the manifestation of physical entities. But we're going to cover the Montauk Chair in just a little bit. Nichols' accounts were not static, and over time, new details emerged, timelines shifted, and the scope of the project expanded. Critics point to these changes as evidence of fabrication or embellishment. Supporters argue that memory suppression with trauma or gradual recall could explain inconsistencies, but Nichols himself claimed that some of the memories surfaced only after repeated exposure to the site or after working with others who shared similar experiences. But what makes Nichols compelling is not just the claims themselves, but how closely they align with known anxieties of the era. The Cold War was defined by fear of invisible threats, radiation, signals, psychological infiltration. Nichols' version of Montauk fits neatly into that mindset, blurring the line between documented research and speculative extension. But whether Nichols was exposing a hidden program, misinterpreting classified work, or constructing a narrative influenced by existing fear remains unresolved to this day. But what is certain is that his testimony shaped everything that followed. Every creature, every time anomaly, every whispered experiment traces back to his account. In Montauk lore, Preston Nichols is not just a witness. He is the lens through which the entire story is viewed. Now, Nichols did not stand alone in all of his claims. He's often cited Duncan Cameron. Sometimes described as a psychic, Cameron is said to have been a key participant in experiments at Camp Hero, specifically those involving telepathy, remote viewing, and time manipulation. According to accounts, he possessed extraordinary abilities that were amplified through the technology at the base. Does it sound familiar yet? Central to Cameron's story is the so-called Montauk chair. Allegedly, when seated in the chair, Cameron could project thoughts into reality. He could manipulate objects and even open portals across time. He is often depicted as a human test subject whose mind was pushed to its absolute limits, sometimes with disastrous consequences. But Cameron's experiences also intersect with other figures in the lore, like Preston Nichols. He is credited with guiding Nichols through recovered memories and often insight into the inner workings of the experiments themselves. Yet much about Cameron remains unclear. His identity, his background, and the veracity of his claims are difficult to confirm, leaving him as both witness and a myth. But in Montauk's stories, Cameron represents the human element of the experiments, the psychic potential, the risks, and the ethical questions that we still ask. Without him, the project's more fantastical elements, like time displacement and manifested entities, would lack a central figure to anchor them to. Al Bielek later entered the narrative, claiming involvement in both the Montauk Project and the Philadelphia experiment, who are closely tied together. Bielek asserted that Montauk was a continuation of earlier naval experiments in invisibility and teleportation. He claimed that his memories were erased and later recovered, placing Montauk within a much larger timeline. He also described time loops, alternative timelines, and memory suppression as core elements of the project. According to his account, experiments went out of control, resulting in unintended consequences that forced the program to shut down. While no documentation supports these claims, they intersect uncomfortably with verified history. Programs like MKUltra, no, not the beverage, confirmed that the government conducted unethical experiments involving mind-altering substances, psychological manipulation, and non-consensual human testing. Again, is this starting to sound familiar? Camp Hero was officially decommissioned in the early 1980s and eventually turned into a state park. The radar tower remained. The underground structures remained sealed. Officially, nothing out of the ordinary ever happened there. But that silence is where the Montauk Project fully lives. For decades, the Montauk Project existed largely on the fringe of public consciousness. It was whispered about in late-night radio shows, chronicled in obscure underground books, and passed quietly from reader to reader, never gaining widespread attention outside of conspiracy circles. Its stories were wild, its claims extraordinary, and yet the lack of mainstream exposure gave it certain mystique. Montauk was a story told in shadows, a narrative for those drawn to mysteries that hovered just beyond the edge of plausibility. But that began to change as pop culture started to mirror the very themes that Montauk embodied. The publication of books detailed Preston Nichols' accounts. The testimony of Duncan Cameron and Al Bielek's recollections brought the story to a broader audience. These accounts, often layered with photographs, alleged documents, and dramatic retellings, transformed Montauk from the obscure conspiracy into a sprawling cult mythology. Every retelling adding new layers, and these include the multiple books written by Preston Nichols that can still be purchased today. Now here's where the story might start to feel a little familiar. The cultural breakthrough for Montauk arrived in the form of Stranger Things. The series was originally conceived under the working title Montauk, and its early concept drew heavily from the alleged experiments involving psychic children, interdimensional portals, and secretive government facilities. The parallels between the show and Montauk Project are very clear. Hawkins National Laboratory in the series echoes Camp Hero, a remote fortified facility conducting ethical, ambiguous experiments on vulnerable children. 11, the show's iconic anti-hero, reflects the recurring Montauk narratives of children with enhanced abilities. The show's shadowy alternate dimension, the Upside Down, mirrors accounts of portals, time anomalies, and otherworldly creatures allegedly produced by Montauk experiments. Even the sense of paranoia, surveillance, and distrust of authority prevalent in the show captures the broader Cold War context from which Montauk myths emerged. Everything was so closely articulated, down to the van that Dustin drove in the series finale with the radar on top, driving through the Upside Down searching for signal. That was based on Preston Nichols. But let's not forget one of the final scenes for Hopper and Joyce, where Hopper receives a new job offer in Montauk, Long Island. Now what about the Demogorgons, you might ask? Are they purely fiction dreamed up by the Duffer Brothers for Stranger Things, or do they have some roots in something real? Now while the Demogorgon itself is a fictional creature inspired by Dungeons & Dragons, the classic game, there was a moment in real life that made people seriously question what might be lurking out there. Enter the Montauk Monster. In July 2008, a bizarre carcass washed up on the shores of Ditch Plains Beach in Montauk. A woman named Jenna Hewitt photographed the creature, and images quickly spread across the internet. The body appeared hairless, with leathery skin, a long tail, exposed teeth, and a beak-like snout. It did not look like any ordinary animal people recognized right away. And naturally, speculation exploded. Some believed it was a government experiment gone wrong. Others connected it to Camp Hero. Because of Montauk's conspiracy-heavy reputation, the creature was immediately pulled into that larger narrative. The idea that something unnatural had escaped an underground facility was too good for the internet to ignore. However, wildlife experts later weighed in. The most widely accepted explanation is far less supernatural. Many zoologists believe the Montauk Monster was simply a raccoon carcass that had decomposed in water, because when mammals decay in saltwater, their fur often falls out and their flesh tightens, exposing teeth and creating the illusion of a beak. Without fur and with advanced decomposition, familiar animals can look disturbingly alien. Still, the mystery was never solved. The carcass reportedly disappeared before formal testing could be done. No DNA results were ever publicly released, and that gap in hard evidence keeps the legend alive. So are Demogorgons real? No evidence suggests that interdimensional predators are roaming the woods just yet. But history shows that when something unexplained surfaces, especially in a place already drenched in conspiracy, imagination will fill in the blanks. The Montauk Monster reminds us of something important. Sometimes reality is strange enough on its own, and sometimes all it takes is one unsettling photograph to blur the line between fiction and folklore. Beyond Stranger Things, Montauk's influence can be traced through other popular media. Films like The Philadelphia Experiment and Close Encounters of the Third Kind touched on hidden government projects and unexplained phenomena. TV shows like Fringe and X-Files drew on similar narratives. secret experiments, psychic abilities, and interdimensional threats. Montauk became a shorthand for certain kind of story. Isolated facilities, children as unwitting participants, science pushed to dangerous extremes, and the unsettling notion that reality might be more malleable than we are willing to accept. Even graphic novels and video games have echoed these themes, creating a feedback loop in which fiction borrows from alleged history, which in turn reinforces the allure of the original claims. Now, as usual, the internet accelerates the process. Forums, blogs, Reddit, social media, they all connect believers, skeptics, and the curious, weaving Montauk into a larger web of conspiracies. MK Ultra and other government secrets were often cited alongside Montauk, blurring distinction between verified historical programs and speculative accounts. Each new retelling, each viral post or video layered additional complexity onto the story. Montauk evolved from a single narrative into a nexus of paranormal and conspiratorial thinking. Ultimately, pop culture did not create the Montauk Project, but it did preserve it. It gave it a form and made it tangible for generations who might have encountered the original testimonies. By transforming the story into movies, shows, and visual media, Montauk moved from whispered folklore into shared cultural mythology. It became something recognizable not just to those who study conspiracies, but to anyone familiar with the idea that hidden experiments, altered children, and monsters in the shadows are a language we understand instinctively. Now, while the Montauk Monster is an enticing legend, another story revolves around what Preston Nichols describes as the beast from the id. According to Nichols, one of the psychic subjects involved in the experiments accidentally manifested a physical entity from their subconscious fears, a creature born entirely of thought and latent emotion. This beast allegedly moved freely within the confines of the base, eluding containment and terrifying anyone who encountered it. Starting to sound like Demogorgons. The accounts described it as amorphous, yet predatory, a shadow of raw psychic energy given flesh, ultimately neutralized only after extraordinary efforts. Whether real, imagined, or something in between, the beast embodies the idea that subconsciousness itself could become a weapon, a theme that recurs through Montauk lore. Shadow figures are another persistent element of Montauk legend. Witnesses describe tall, indistinct silhouettes appearing near the radar tower or along the cliffs at dusk or dawn. Sometimes fleeting, sometimes lingering, these shadows are accompanied by a profound sense of unease, feelings of dread, sometimes disorientation or an instinctual sense of being watched. They are often described in the same breath as whispers of hidden corridors, secret experiments, and the sense that reality itself is being subtly warped by forces beyond comprehension. These shadows blur the line between physical and the imagined, leaving witnesses to question whether what they saw was external or simply projected from their own fears. Montauk lore also includes reports of time-displaced humans, individuals who appear human but behave strangely, as if out of step with the present. Their speech is erratic, their movements sometimes robotic, sometimes chaotic. According to accounts, these beings were allegedly pulled from other points in time during experiments involving the Montauk chair or other devices. They are described as lost, disoriented, and dangerous, embodying the consequences of tampering with forces no one fully understands. In some stories, these displaced individuals interact with staff or passerby before vanishing as mysterious as they appeared, reinforcing the narrative that Montauk experiments could breach not just minds, but time itself. And much like we mentioned before, children with enhanced abilities appear repeatedly in Montauk narratives. These children are rarely named, rarely even described in detail, but they are central to the myth. They are often portrayed as physically gifted or otherwise altered by experimentation, capable of telepathy, telekinesis, or even inadvertently manifesting phenomena that terrorize the base. In many ways, they function less as individuals and more as symbols. The human cost of experimentation, the innocence corrupted, the potential unleashed without their consent. Now it's starting to sound very familiar.
You are like Papa!
Of all of these entities, Montauk Monster, Beast from the Id, the shadow figures, the time-displaced humans, the gifted children, they persist not because any have been verified, but because the stories repeat. Each retelling is reinforcing this myth. But where's the proof? Each sighting, each account, or each photograph adds weight to that narrative, but refuses to fade. A web of stories intertwined with fear, imagination, and the uneasy possibility that somewhere, in the shadows of Camp Hero, something truly strange just might have existed. Now for the cold, honest truth. Beyond these testimonies, beyond Preston Nichols and Duncan, there is no physical evidence to substantiate the more extraordinary claims at Camp Hero. Nothing remains of underground laboratories, time travel devices, or physical amplification chambers, as far as we know. The radar towers and bunkers at Camp Hero exist, of course, you can see them. But these are well-documented military installations with clear defensive purposes. No documents confirm that alleged experiments in time manipulation, entity manifestation, or physical projection ever happened. The absence of evidence, however, does not prevent the story from surviving. Sometimes it even strengthens it. Recovered memory is central to Montauk lore, but it introduces another layer of uncertainty. Memory is not a perfect recording. It's reconstructed each time it is recalled, subject to suggestion and the influence of others, and now the influence of one of the most popular TV shows of our generation. In Montauk, recovered memory becomes both the foundation of the story and the source of its most glaring contradiction, and yet, the Montauk Project survives. What is often ignored in the Montauk narrative is how secrecy itself fuels the mythology. During the Cold War, silence was standard operating procedure. Military installments, research programs, and classified projects were deliberately concealed, not necessarily because they were dangerous, but because secrecy was considered essential for national security. Information was withheld, redacted, or completely erased. The public saw only what the government allowed, leaving vast gaps for speculation, rumor, and fear to grow. Camp Hero, in this sense, became the perfect canvas for it. Its imposing radio tower, concrete bunkers, and sprawling grounds looked ominous, not because of what was there, but because of what was hidden. Its isolation, the lack of public access, and the absence of explanation made it a breeding ground for stories that went far beyond military functions. To many, a closed facility becomes more threatening than an open one. Its walls, silent and weathered, suggested that something extraordinary or even terrifying just might have occurred inside. Conspiracy theories only magnified the mystique. Some claim that Montauk was part of the continuation of the Philadelphia experiment, like we mentioned before, linking teleportation, invisibility, and even time travel experiments from the 1940s back to Camp Hero in the 1970s and 80s. Others make suggestions to the mind control programs that were secretly conducted on children, alien contact, interdimensional portals, genetically modified creatures, and the experiments in manifesting the human psyche all appear in various counts. In this sense, Montauk demonstrates how gaps in knowledge and the inability to verify claims create a fertile ground for imagination and myth-making. Now, many conspiracy stories like this about secret experiments and supernatural beings lose their impact once they're simplified or repeated. Montauk never reached that point. This story was well known and well circulated prior to the popularity of Stranger Things on Netflix, but you have to imagine it's even more amplified now. You can read the accounts, the books, or visit Camp Hero. You may find threads of truth or nothing worth thinking twice about. Radar towers remain, bunkers are sealed, and the coastline is quiet. The fragments of Montauk, psychic experiments, children with unusual abilities, strange creatures rarely align perfectly. Camp Hero still stands, overlooking the Atlantic, silent and sealed. Whether Montauk was a radio station or something more, depends on how you interpret the silence. Paranormal Unsettled returns on April 6th as we cover the lives of 5 women and 1 child who were labeled, feared, and remembered for the worst version of their story. Annabelle Higgins, Sarah Winchester, Mull Dyer, the Bell Witch, and finally, Bathsheba Sherman. I'm Johnny Clash, and this is Paranormal Unsettled.
Paranormal Unsettled is written and produced by Johnny Clash. Want more unsettling content? Subscribe to Johnny Clash XP on YouTube and Paranormal Unsettled on TikTok. For gaming content, follow on Twitch and social media at Johnny FN Clash. Like and subscribe.